My daughter-in-law texted me, "Eat all the leftovers. You are used to scraps anyway." I simply replied, "Okay." But what I did next made them regret their actions. When they came home and opened the door to their $2 million house, what they saw left them completely frozen. And fear filled my daughter-in-law's face. My name is Nia, and at 35 years old, I am still learning that no good deed goes unpunished. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled people who completely underestimated your worth, especially when those people are supposed to be family. Growing up, I was taught that you protect your own, that you build a legacy, and that you demand respect through your actions, not just your words. Tonight, I was about to put all three of those lessons into practice. The grand dining room of the Oakwood estate was a disaster zone. It was late on Thanksgiving night, the kind of dark and quiet hour where the rest of the world is asleep, heavy with gratitude and good food. But in this house, there was only the deafening silence of disrespect. The long mahogany dining table, a piece I had personally selected from an estate sale in Charleston, was littered with half-eaten food and careless spills. A dark red stain of expensive Pinot Noir was slowly seeping into the hand-woven table runner. Smeared cranberry sauce dotted the imported marble countertops of the open kitchen. I stood at the massive farmhouse sink, my hands elbow-deep in warm, soapy water. I was methodically scrubbing the antique gold-rimmed china plates. These were not just any plates. They were my late mother-in-law's plates brought over specifically for this occasion because I wanted to make this first holiday in their new home special. I had spent 12 grueling hours in this kitchen preparing a Michelin-quality spread. Herb butter roasted turkey truffle macaroni and cheese, slow-braised collard greens, and a sweet potato soufflé that took hours to perfect. And now the remnants of my labor of love were scattered like trash. Jamal, my 23-year-old stepson, and Chloe, his 24-year-old wife of exactly 6 months, were not here. They had left over an hour ago. Right as the last bite of pie was swallowed, Chloe had loudly announced that they were late for an exclusive after-party with her friends downtown. Jamal, ever the eager-to-please husband, had simply grabbed his coat, muttered a quick thanks for the food, and followed her out the door. They left me the woman who had cooked the entire meal to clean up the wreckage like a hired maid. As I rinsed the last plate and set it delicately on the drying rack, my phone buzzed on the kitchen island. The screen lit up in the dim room. It was a text message from Chloe. I dried my hands slowly on a linen towel, my face completely expressionless, and picked up the phone. The message read, "Eat all the leftovers. You are used to scraps anyway." I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer audacity of those words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. You are used to scraps anyway. It was a loaded statement dripping with classist arrogance and subtle racial undertones. Chloe was a white woman who had grown up in a comfortable upper-middle-class bubble, sheltered from the realities of hard work. When she looked at me, a 35-year-old black woman, she did not see a peer. She saw someone beneath her. She saw someone she could casually discard and insult. I did not cry. Tears are an ocean for women who do not have a boat, and I had built a luxury cruise liner. I simply locked my phone and took a deep breath, letting the cold reality of the situation wash over me. Through my calm exterior, a lifetime of resilience was churning. Chloe thought she knew me. She thought I was just a lucky widow living off the ghost of Jamal's father. I married his father when I was 22. He was older, kind, and possessed a vision for a restaurant that was slowly failing. When he passed away unexpectedly when I was just 30, he left me heartbroken with a 10-year-old boy to raise and a business drowning in debt. I did not eat scraps then, and I certainly do not eat them now. I rolled up my sleeves and worked 80-hour weeks. I took that failing single restaurant and turned it into a massive, highly profitable culinary empire and real estate portfolio. I became a self-made millionaire through sweat strategy and an iron will. I loved Jamal like my own flesh and blood. I made sure he went to the best private schools, fully funded his college trust, and never felt the financial panic that had kept me awake for years. When Jamal married Chloe, I wanted to give them the ultimate wedding gift, a head start in life. I bought this magnificent $2 million house in the prestigious Oakwood neighborhood. But I did not write the check blindly. I bought it through one of my limited liability companies. The LLC held the deed. The LLC leased the luxury furniture. The LLC even held the titles to the 2 expensive cars currently sitting in the garage. Jamal knew the house was a gift to use, but he was incredibly naive about the legal structures. Chloe, blinded by her own greed and entitlement, simply assumed that because she married Jamal, everything automatically belonged to her. She thought she was the queen of a castle I had built brick by brick. She looked at my understated jewelry, my quiet demeanor, and the fact that I preferred cooking a holiday meal over hiring caterers, and concluded I was a weak, uncultured woman who got lucky. She thought she could disrespect the woman who practically handed her a life of luxury on a silver platter. I looked around the spectacular living room. The vaulted ceilings, the custom velvet sofas, the enormous flat-screen television mounted above the stone fireplace. It was a beautiful illusion, and Chloe had just shattered the glass. I picked up my phone again. I opened the text thread with Chloe. I did not write a paragraph defending myself. I did not curse her out. I did not call Jamal crying about how his wife was treating me. Emotional reactions are what people like Chloe feed on. They want you to lose your composure so they can paint you as the aggressive one. I simply typed 2 letters. Okay, I hit send. Then I walked over to the heavy mahogany front door and engaged the deadbolt. I walked to the security panel and disabled the codes that Jamal and Chloe used, replacing them with the master override. The house chirped, confirming the perimeter was secure. I opened my contacts and scrolled down to the letter M. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear. It rang twice before a deep alert voice answered. "Hey, Nia," the voice said. It was Marcus, the chief logistics manager for my restaurant and real estate group. He handled everything from emergency restaurant supply runs to property management for my various investments. He was brilliant, fiercely loyal, and available 24/7. "Marcus." I said, my voice eerily calm, smooth as glass. "I'm sorry to bother you on Thanksgiving night, but I have a level 1 priority." "Tell me what you need, boss," he replied without a moment of hesitation. "I need the elite property transition crew at the Oakwood residence." I told him, pacing slowly across the dark hardwood floors. "I need them here in exactly 20 minutes." "The Oakwood house?" Marcus asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. "You mean Jamal's place?" "It is my place, Marcus," I corrected him gently but firmly. "And right now it is full of my things. I want it emptied." "Emptied," he repeated, "like the furniture." Like everything I said, stopping in the center of the living room, my eyes sweeping over the lavish decor. The couches, the tables, the art on the walls, the rugs, the televisions. Strip the guest rooms. Strip the master suite. If my LLC paid for it, it goes into a truck tonight. Leave the house looking like it did the day the builders handed over the keys. There was a brief pause on the line. Then Marcus chuckled softly, the sound of a man who knew better than to question my judgment. "I am on it. How many trucks do you want me to bring?" "Bring the big trucks, Marcus," I said, staring at the empty wine bottle Chloe had carelessly left on her custom coffee table. "Bring all of them." I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up a damp rag, and began wiping down the marble countertops. I was no longer cleaning up after ungrateful children. I was simply preparing the staging area. The disrespect had finally reached its peak, and the demolition of Chloe's perfect stolen world was about to begin. Just 3 short hours ago, this very dining room had been the stage for a masterclass in disrespect. The air had been thick with the smell of roasted turkey savory spices and the sharp tang of artificial superiority. I remember standing at the head of the long mahogany table, placing the massive ceramic platter of food down with careful precision. The crystal chandelier cast a warm, inviting glow over the room, illuminating the faces of the people I was supposed to call family. But instead of gratitude, the evening had quickly devolved into a quiet, psychological warfare. When Chloe's parents, Brenda and Bradley, arrived at 7 o'clock, they walked through the front double doors like they were inspecting a property they intended to buy. Brenda was a woman who wore her wealth like a weapon, wielding it to make everyone else feel small. She had stiff blonde hair, a tailored beige pantsuit that looked entirely too restrictive for a holiday dinner, and eyes that constantly scanned the room for imperfections. Bradley was a quiet, imposing man with a permanent scowl, clutching a bottle of mid-range wine as if it were a rare, priceless artifact he was generously bestowing upon us. They had barely taken off their coats before Brenda began making snide comments about the neighborhood acting as though Jamal had somehow won the lottery to afford such a magnificent place. She had absolutely no idea she was standing in a house I paid for in cash from my own hard-earned business accounts. I greeted them warmly, taking their coats and offering them drinks, playing the gracious host, because that is what my mother taught me to do. But from the very moment Brenda looked at me, I saw the familiar icy glint of condescension. She looked at my simple black dress and my natural hair, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, trying to place me in a subordinate box that made her comfortable. We finally sat down for dinner. The table was practically groaning under the immense weight of the feast I had prepared. I had been up since 6 in the morning brining the turkey in a secret blend of spices, chopping fresh herbs until my hands ached, and carefully following the exact recipes that had made my restaurant a beloved staple in the city. The aroma alone was enough to make anyone's mouth water, a perfect symphony of garlic, rosemary, and butter. Bradley took his first bite of the truffle macaroni and cheese, and his eyes widened in genuine shock. He actually stopped chewing for a moment, completely impressed by the flavor profile. He looked across the table, pointing his fork, and said, "This is absolutely phenomenal. I have eaten at 5-star restaurants in Paris and New York that cannot make macaroni and cheese like this." I smiled warmly and opened my mouth to say thank you, glad that my hard work was being appreciated. But before the words could even leave my lips, Chloe let out a bright, piercing, artificial laugh that grated on my nerves. "Oh, thank you so much, Daddy," she cooed, reaching over the table to pat his hand affectionately. I was so worried the truffle oil would be too strong. I really wanted everything to be absolutely perfect for your first Thanksgiving in our brand new home. I froze in my seat. I looked directly at Chloe, expecting her to wink at me or quickly clarify to her parents that I had actually done all the cooking. She did not. She simply took another slow sip of her white wine and selfishly soaked up her father's glowing praise. She had not so much as chopped a single onion or boiled a pot of water all day. She had spent the entire morning at a luxury day spa with her friends arriving home just in time to change into a designer silk dress right before her parents arrived. I slowly turned my gaze to Jamal. He knew exactly how hard I had worked. He had watched me prep the meal for the last 2 days. I watched him swallow a piece of turkey, his eyes nervously darting down to his expensive porcelain plate. He adjusted his collar and took a long, desperate sip of his red wine. He chose absolute silence. He chose to let his entitled wife steal the credit for my grueling labor rather than simply correct his wealthy new-in-laws. The betrayal stung deeply, but I kept my face perfectly neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me upset. I quietly ate my meal, listening to Brenda and Bradley interrogate Jamal about his career prospects and his financial portfolio. Then, Brenda turned her sharp, calculating gaze directly toward me. She rested her elbows on the fine linen tablecloth, steepling her manicured fingers. So Nia, she began drawing out my name like it tasted sour in her mouth. "Chloe tells me you run a little food business. That must be so terribly exhausting for someone your age." I smiled politely, keeping my voice perfectly even and professional. "It is a restaurant group, actually. We have 4 locations. And yes, it requires a significant amount of dedication, but I truly enjoy the work I do." Brenda raised a perfectly drawn eyebrow, looking at me as if I had just claimed to be an astronaut. "A restaurant group. Well, isn't that ambitious of you? You are surprisingly articulate for someone working in the service industry." The entire table fell dead silent. The microaggression was so incredibly loud it practically echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. Surprisingly articulate. It was a vile phrase I had heard before, a backhanded compliment specifically designed to remind me that as a successful black woman, my intelligence and eloquence were considered an anomaly in her privileged world. She then reached across the table, gesturing vaguely toward my head with a look of mild disgust. "And your hair. It is just so brave how you wear it natural like that. I could never pull off something so unkempt and wild for a formal dinner. I felt a slow, hot anger burning deep in my chest. I looked at Jamal again, practically pleading with him through my eyes. This was his moment. This was the exact moment a grown son stands up and firmly tells his guests that they will not disrespect the mother who raised him, especially not in her own home. But Jamal just sat there, shrinking down into his expensive leather chair. He gave a weak, incredibly uncomfortable little laugh and muttered, "Yeah, the food is really good, babe." He completely ignored Brenda's blatant insult. He sacrificed my dignity on the altar of his own crippling insecurity. He wanted these white wealthy people to accept him so badly that he was entirely willing to let them treat me like the hired help. The ultimate insult came just as the sweet potato soufflé was being served for dessert. Chloe, clearly emboldened by her parents' social dominance and Jamal's pathetic cowardice, reached carelessly across the table to grab the open bottle of Pinot Noir. In her reckless haste, her elbow clipped her full, oversized wine glass. The deep red liquid tipped over, cascading off the edge of the mahogany table and splashing directly onto the vintage Persian rug beneath us. I gasped loudly and pushed my heavy chair back. That rug was not just a random piece of home decor. It was one of the very few precious things I had kept from my late husband, Jamal's father. He had bought it for us on our honeymoon in a vibrant market in Morocco. It was a deeply personal, irreplaceable piece of our shared history, a memory of a man who had loved us both fiercely. Chloe barely even flinched at the mess she made. She looked down at the dark spreading stain soaking into the intricate woven fabric, then looked up at me with a lazy, dismissive smirk. "Oops," she said, her tone utterly devoid of any genuine apology or concern. "Well, that is a real shame." She then leaned back in her chair, waved her hand in my general direction like she was dismissing a servant, and added, "You can scrub that out later, right?" She did not offer to grab a towel. She did not apologize to Jamal for ruining his deceased father's prized heirloom. She just commanded me to clean it up on my hands and knees, cementing my role as her absolute subordinate. And Jamal the boy, I had lovingly raised the boy whose own father had cherished that rug, looked at the terrible stain, looked at my devastated face, and said absolutely nothing to defend me. The painful memory faded, bringing me crashing back to the cold, quiet reality of the present kitchen. I was finally done scrubbing the last of the antique plates. I dried my hands one final time, the simmering anger from 3 hours ago now hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I walked slowly to the front window and peered through the expensive wooden blinds. Down the long, sweeping driveway, 2 massive, unmarked moving trucks were pulling up quietly, their heavy headlights cutting through the dark Thanksgiving night. They parked silently in a row, the large diesel engines cutting off one by one. Marcus and his elite transition crew were incredibly fast. Just as I turned away from the glass window, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my pocket again. I pulled it out, fully expecting a text from Marcus, saying they were ready at the front door. Instead, the name flashing on the bright screen made the blood run completely cold in my veins. It was a message from Jamal. I opened the text message. It read, "Hey Ma. Chloe wants to redecorate the dining room this weekend. She is throwing out Dad's old rug tomorrow morning. Hope you do not mind." I stared blankly at the glowing words. Hope you do not mind. He was cowardly letting his vicious new wife throw away his own father's sacred legacy just to keep her temporarily happy. Any tiny, lingering shred of guilt I had about what I was about to do evaporated instantly into the crisp night air. I locked the phone screen and slipped the device deep back into my pocket. My eyes turned to cold, unforgiving steel. I walked purposefully to the heavy front door and unlocked the deadbolt to let the movers inside. It was time to clear the house completely. I opened the heavy front door to the crisp night air. Marcus stood on the porch with his arms crossed over his chest. Behind him, a team of 10 men dressed in matching dark uniforms waited in absolute silence. These were the men who built out my restaurant interiors and managed my commercial properties. They were fast, efficient, and they asked 0 questions. I stepped aside and motioned for them to enter the grand foyer. As they filed into the house, I could see the faint surprise in their eyes when they looked at the mess in the dining room. Marcus walked up to me and asked where I wanted them to start. I told him to start in the living room and work their way up. Every single piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every rug on the floor needed to go into those trucks. Marcus nodded slowly and gave the signal to his team. To understand why I could legally strip this $2 million house to its bare studs, you have to understand my secret weapon. Chloe and Jamal did not own this property. When Jamal and Chloe got engaged, they were completely broke financially. Jamal was trying to launch a tech startup that was bleeding money, and Chloe was working part-time at a boutique while pretending to be a wealthy influencer on social media. I wanted them to have a solid foundation, but I was not foolish enough to just hand over a massive asset to a young couple. I purchased this house through one of my holding companies, a limited liability corporation, where I am the sole managing member. The deed recorded at the county clerk office had my company name on it. Furthermore, I knew Chloe cared deeply about outward appearances. She wanted the designer aesthetic without putting in the designer work. So my company leased every single piece of luxury furniture in this house. The custom Italian leather sectionals, the hand-carved, wooden bed frames, the expensive modern art hanging in the hallways, all of it was legally owned by my corporate entity. Even the 2 luxury vehicles parked in the 3-car garage were company vehicles leased under my corporate account. Chloe had spent the last 6 months parading around town, bragging to her friends about her incredible wealth, acting like she was the queen of high society. She had absolutely no idea that her entire rich wife aesthetic was entirely funded by the very same black woman she had just called a scrap eater. She was nothing more than a glorified tenant living rent-free in a house I built. The crew moved with breathtaking speed. In the living room, 4 men lifted the massive custom velvet sofa and carried it out the front door. Another 2 men carefully unmounted the 85-inch television from the stone fireplace, wrapping it in thick protective blankets before loading it onto a dolly. I stood in the center, perfectly. I directed the operation like a symphony conductor. Take the side tables I ordered. Pack up the crystal vases, the lamps, the books on the shelves. Leave absolutely nothing behind. The men nodded and continued their silent, methodical work. I walked into the massive gourmet kitchen. I pointed at the high-end espresso machine sitting on the marble counter. "Pack it up," I said. I pointed at the custom bar stools. "Pack those too." I even opened the pantry and told them to take the expensive imported olive oils and truffles that I had purchased for them last month yesterday. Within 30 minutes, the entire first floor of the house was completely unrecognizable. The luxurious, warm home that Chloe loved to show off on her social media accounts was gone. In its place was a cold, echoing shell of drywall and hardwood floors. Every footstep echoed loudly in the empty space. Marcus approached me with a clipboard asking if I wanted them to move to the second floor. I told him yes, and I told him to be especially thorough in the master suite. I followed the crew up the grand sweeping staircase. The master bedroom was a massive space. It had a vaulted ceiling and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the backyard. Chloe had decorated it to look like a high-end boutique hotel room. There was a massive king-size bed with a plush, tufted headboard, expensive silk drapes, and a large custom vanity where she spent hours doing her makeup. "Take the bed," I told the men. "Take the nightstands, the dressers, the rugs." I walked into the attached master bathroom and pointed at the stacks of plush monogram designer towels sitting on the floating shelves. "Put those in a garbage bag and load them in." "Load them into the truck," I instructed. Chloe wanted to treat me like a maid, so I was going to clean her house better than any maid ever could. I watched as the men systematically dismantled her perfect little sanctuary. They removed the expensive silk sheets, took apart the heavy wooden bed frame, and rolled up the plush white carpet. The room was quickly becoming bare, stripped down to the cold, hard reality of what she actually owned, which was absolutely nothing. I decided to help the crew speed up the process in the master bedroom while they were busy. I walked over to the massive corner closet to gather the custom velvet hangers I had provided. While navigating around the men carrying out the heavy dressers, I accidentally bumped hard into Chloe's makeup vanity. It was a heavy, antique-style piece made of dark wood, covered in expensive cosmetics glass perfume bottles and tangled jewelry. The impact of my hip against the wood caused the vanity to tip slightly. I quickly reached out to catch it before it could crash onto the hardwood floor. As I pushed the heavy wooden table back against the wall, I heard a sound. I heard a strange clicking sound coming from underneath the main drawer. I frowned and crouched down to inspect the piece of furniture. I ran my hand along the bottom edge of the wood. There was a small, hidden latch concealed behind a decorative piece of molding. Curiosity got the best of me. I pressed the latch. A secret compartment flush with the bottom of the drawer sprang open with a soft pop. A thick stack of papers slid out and cascaded onto the floor around my feet. I knelt down and began to pick them up, fully expecting this. I expected to find old love letters or private diary entries. But as my eyes scanned the top page of the scattered documents, my heart suddenly skipped a beat. The air in the room seemed to freeze. These were not diary pages. They were financial statements. I picked up the first stack. It was a credit card bill in Chloe's name. The balance was staggering. $35,000 on a single card marked heavily overdue with bright red warning notices. I picked up another statement, $20,000 on a different card. Then another for $15,000 clearly. As I quickly shuffled through the thick pile of hidden mail, I did some fast mental math. Chloe was hiding over $150,000 in severe delinquent credit card debt. She had been secretly funding her extravagant lifestyle, buying designer bags, expensive shoes, and spa treatments, all on credit she could never possibly repay. But the debt was not the worst part. At the very bottom of the hidden compartment, wrapped in a rubber band, was a formal legal document printed on thick, high-quality paper. I pulled off the rubber band and unfolded the legal document. My eyes scanned the dense legal text. It was a commercial loan application. Chloe was attempting to take out a massive personal loan, and to my absolute horror, I saw what she was using as collateral. She had listed this very house, the $2 million Oakwood property, as the primary collateral for the loan. She genuinely believed Jamal owned the house, and she was trying to leverage it behind his back to bail herself out of her massive financial hole. But the most chilling detail was at the very bottom of the signature page. There, written in blue ink. It was Jamal's signature. I knew my stepson's handwriting perfectly. I had read his school essays and signed his report cards for a decade. The signature on this legal loan document was a complete and total forgery. Chloe was not just an entitled, disrespectful brat. She was a desperate con artist, actively attempting to commit financial fraud, and she was entirely willing to completely destroy my stepson's life to save her own skin. I sat there on the cold hardwood floor of the empty master bedroom, staring at the forged signature until the blue ink blurred before my tired eyes. I sat perfectly still on the cold hardwood floor of the empty master bedroom. The heavy silence of the stripped house pressed against my ears. In my hands, the stack of glossy financial statements felt heavier than a block of concrete. The soft glow from the hallway light spilled over my shoulder, illuminating the damning evidence of Chloe and her hidden life. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart and began to sift through the papers one by one. The first statement was from an exclusive platinum credit card. The balance at the top of the page was printed in bold red ink. It was $35,000. I scanned the itemized list of charges. There were massive transactions at luxury boutiques in Paris, expensive spa retreats in the mountains, and high-end jewelry stores downtown. These were the reckless expenditures of someone obsessed with an illusion of wealth. I placed that statement face down on the floor and picked up the next one. This card had a balance of $42,000. The charges here were equally frivolous. Designer shoes, exorbitant bar tabs at elite nightclubs, and continuous online shopping sprees. I picked up a third statement, then a fourth. The numbers kept climbing. 15,000 here, 28,000 there. I did the mental math as my eyes darted across the terrifying red numbers. Chloe was hiding over $150,000 in severe delinquent credit card debt. She had been living a complete lie. She spent her days parading around the country club, mocking my hard work, while secretly drowning in a financial sinkhole of her own making. The sheer magnitude of her deception was breathtaking. She was not just irresponsible. She was financially toxic. She was a black hole consuming everything around her. Every swipe of those plastic cards was another lie told to my son. Every luxury item was a physical manifestation of her deceit. But the credit card statements were only the beginning of the nightmare. I reached for the thick, formal legal document I had found at the very bottom of the secret drawer. It was printed on heavy bond paper, the kind used for serious banking contracts. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. It was a commercial loan application from a predatory private lending firm. Chloe was attempting to secure a massive personal loan to consolidate her insurmountable debt. But private lenders do not hand out six-figure loans out of the goodness of their hearts. They require substantial collateral. I read the section labeled Assets and Security. My blood ran completely cold. The address printed on the line for the primary collateral was the address of this very house, the $2 million Oakwood property. Chloe genuinely believed that Jamal owned this house outright. She thought his name was on the deed, and she was actively trying to leverage my property behind his back to bail herself out of her massive financial ruin. I flipped to the final page of the loan application. There at the bottom were the required signature lines. Chloe had signed her name with her usual dramatic looping script, but right next to her signature was the line for the CO borrower. And there, written in steady blue ink, was Jamal and his full legal name. I stared at the signature until my vision blurred. I knew my stepson and his handwriting intimately. I had kept every birthday card, every school project, and every note he had ever written to me. I knew the specific way he crossed his letters and the slight slant of his cursive. The signature on this legal document was a meticulous, calculated forgery. Chloe had practiced his signature and signed his name to a fraudulent loan application. The sheer audacity of her actions made me feel physically ill. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. I dropped the papers onto the floor and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. Chloe was not just a racist, entitled brat who liked to make snide comments at dinner parties. She was a dangerous con artist. She was actively attempting to commit federal wire fraud and bank fraud. And worse, she was entirely willing to completely destroy my stepson and his entire financial future to save her own skin. If this loan had gone through and she inevitably defaulted on the payments, the predatory lenders would have come after Jamal. They would have destroyed his credit score, seized his bank accounts, and attempted to foreclose on the house. She was setting him up to take the fall for her own sociopathic greed. I felt a sudden fierce surge of maternal protectiveness rise up in my chest. I had spent my entire adult life working myself to the bone to ensure Jamal would never have to experience the crushing weight of poverty. His father and I had built our empire specifically so our boy could have a secure, prosperous future. I had endured the sleepless nights, the grueling restaurant shifts, and the endless stress of business ownership to build a fortress around him. And now this deceitful woman had slipped past the gates and was trying to burn the entire castle to the ground from the inside. The petty disrespect she had shown me earlier in the evening suddenly felt completely insignificant. This was no longer about a ruined Thanksgiving dinner or a spilled glass of wine. This was a battle for my son and his survival. I realized that kicking her out of the house was no longer enough. I had to completely dismantle her ability to ever harm him again. I carefully gathered the financial statements and the forged loan application. I stacked them neatly and placed them inside my leather handbag. These documents were no longer just a secret. They were a loaded weapon, and I was fully prepared to pull the trigger. The anger that had been simmering inside me all night had finally crystallized into absolute focus. I stood up slowly, my muscles tense with a new, dangerous energy. The moving crew had finished their work on the second floor. The master bedroom was now a hollow, echoing cube of drywall and glass. I walked out into the empty hallway and headed toward the top of the grand staircase. The house was dead quiet. Marcus and his men had already packed the last of the furniture into the massive trucks outside. I was alone in the cavernous space. Just as I reached the first step, I heard the distinct sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. I paused, my hand resting on the polished wooden banister. I glanced at my watch. It was far too early for Jamal and Chloe to be returning from their downtown party. They had only left a couple of hours ago, and Chloe always insisted on staying out until the early hours of the morning to be seen by the right people. I walked softly down the stairs and moved toward the large bay window in the front living room. I pulled back the edge of the heavy curtain just enough to peer out into the darkness. A sleek silver luxury sedan was parked haphazardly at the end of the driveway, blocking the path of the moving trucks. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the manicured lawn. The driver and passenger doors swung open simultaneously. I watched as two figures stepped out into the cold night air. It was Brenda and Bradley. Chloe and her wealthy, arrogant parents had returned. They marched aggressively up the long driveway, their coats billowing behind them. Brenda was clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest, her face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. Bradley was walking a step ahead of her, his fists clenched at his sides. I knew exactly why they were here. Brenda had deliberately left her favorite clutch purse on the dining room chair earlier that evening, a classic manipulation tactic to ensure she had an excuse to return and snoop around the house without an invitation. They were expecting to walk into a quiet house and find me scrubbing the floors. They had no idea they were about to walk into an empty shell, and they had absolutely no idea that I was standing in the dark holding the evidence of their precious daughter and her massive fraudulent crimes. I let the heavy curtain fall back into place, plunging the room back into shadows. I walked over to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and waited for them to ring the bell. The game was about to change completely. I sat alone in the cavernous expanse of the stripped living room. The single metal folding chair felt cold against my back, but I welcomed the discomfort. It kept me sharp. It kept me focused. The silence in the massive house was heavy, broken only by the occasional settling of the wood and the distant howling of the late November wind outside. I had turned off all the main overhead lights, leaving only the dim glow of the entryway chandelier to cast long, dramatic shadows across the bare floorboards. Everything I had paid for was gone. The luxurious custom sofas, the hand-woven silk rugs, the massive television, the carefully curated artwork, everything was securely packed away in the moving trucks headed toward my secure storage facility. The house was now exactly what Chloe and Jamal actually owned, a hollow, echoing shell. I had spent the last 30 minutes carefully reviewing every single piece of paper I found hidden in Chloe's vanity. The initial shock of the credit card debt and the forged loan application had settled into a cold, calculated fury. But as I dug deeper into the stack, I found the true masterpiece of her deception. Tucked behind a final notice from a collection agency was a printed bank statement belonging to Brenda and Bradley. It was a joint retirement account statement showing a massive unauthorized wire transfer. Chloe had not just forged my stepson's signature to steal my house. She had actively hacked into her own parents' life savings, draining a devastating sum of money to temporarily quiet the predators she owed. She was a financial parasite feeding on anyone who loved her. Suddenly, the sharp chime of the doorbell shattered the quiet emptiness of the house. The sound bounced violently off the bare walls, echoing down the empty hallways. I did not flinch. I slowly gathered the financial documents, slipped them into a plain manila folder, and placed the folder on the floor right beside my chair. I took one final deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress, and stood up. I walked with deliberate, measured steps across the large room and stepped into the dim foyer. I reached out and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. As I pulled the massive door open, the freezing autumn night air rushed into the warm entryway. Standing on the front porch, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving yellow glow of the security light, were Brenda and Bradley. They both looked incredibly agitated. Their breath plumed in the chilly air, and their postures were rigid with arrogant annoyance. Brenda was aggressively clutching her expensive designer coat tightly around her thin frame. Bradley was standing right behind her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his jaw locked in a deep, menacing scowl. Before I could even open my mouth to say a word of greeting, Brenda physically pushed past me. She completely ignored my presence, as if I were nothing more than a doorman hired to facilitate her life. Bradley followed closely behind her, marching into the house without so much as a polite nod or a simple, "Excuse me." They were operating on pure, unadulterated entitlement, fully expecting to walk back into the warm, luxurious space they had commanded just a few short hours earlier. "I forgot my evening clutch on the dining room chair," Brenda announced loudly as she stomped aggressively through the entryway. Her sharp high heels clicked loudly against the bare wood, the sound ringing out strangely in the empty space. She did not bother to look back at me. She just kept walking, completely focused on her fabricated mission. "I need it right now because my driver's license and all my platinum credit cards are inside. It is completely absurd that I had to drive all the way back here in the middle of the freezing night just to retrieve a purse. I expect you to be more careful when cleaning up next time." I quietly closed the heavy front door behind them, the latch clicking shut with a finality they did not yet understand. I leaned my back against the solid wood and folded my arms across my chest. I did not say a single word. I simply watched them walk further into the trap. Brenda rounded the corner from the foyer and stepped confidently into the massive open-concept living room. And then she stopped completely dead in her tracks. Her body went entirely rigid. Bradley bumped heavily into her back, letting out an annoyed grunt before he looked over her shoulder and saw exactly what she was seeing. The sudden silence that fell over them was absolutely deafening. The sprawling living room, which just hours ago had been a picture of extreme wealth and comfort, was completely barren. The moonlight streamed through the uncovered windows, revealing the stark emptiness. Every single piece of furniture was gone. The beautiful artwork had been stripped from the drywall, leaving behind nothing but small metal nails. Even the heavy velvet curtains had been uninstalled. The space looked like an abandoned warehouse waiting for demolition. I slowly walked out of the shadows of the foyer and entered the living room. I walked past them and returned to the center of the room. I sat down slowly on the metal folding chair, crossing my legs elegantly, and rested my hands gracefully in my lap. I looked directly at them, waiting for their privileged brains to process the stark reality of the situation. Brenda slowly turned her head. Her mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of profound confusion and rising panic. She looked wildly around the barren room, her gaze darting from the empty corners to the bare ceiling. Bradley was breathing heavily, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson as the shock began to wear off, and his natural aggression began to take over. "What on earth is going on here?" Brenda finally managed to whisper. Her voice was trembling, completely stripped of its usual arrogant confidence. "Where is everything? Where is my daughter's beautiful furniture? Where are her things?" I did not blink. I kept my face perfectly neutral, a completely unreadable mask of calm authority. I simply watched her panic grow. When I did not answer immediately, Brenda's confusion violently morphed into absolute rage. The thin veneer of polite society completely vanished, revealing the vicious, entitled woman underneath. She stomped her expensive heel against the bare floorboards and pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. "Answer me right now!" Brenda screamed at the top of her lungs. Her high-pitched voice echoed harshly against the empty walls, making her sound completely unhinged. "What did you do? You robbed her. You actually robbed my daughter. I cannot believe this. You came into her beautiful home while she was out celebrating, and you stole absolutely everything she owns. You are a criminal." Bradley took a heavy, threatening step toward me, his chest puffed out aggressively. He looked like a man fully ready to use physical intimidation to assert his dominance. "Listen to me very closely," he growled, his voice deep and menacing. "You are going to tell us exactly where those moving trucks went, or I am going to make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life in a federal prison cell. You have absolutely no idea who you are messing with. I have the best lawyers in the city on retainer. I will destroy your little restaurant business. I will ruin your life." I remained sitting perfectly still on the cold metal folding chair. I did not shrink back. I did not raise my voice defensively. I simply let their pathetic threats wash over me. The more they screamed, the more power they freely handed over to me. Their anger was entirely based on an illusion, a house of cards that was about to collapse under its own weight. "You are a complete psychopath!" Brenda shrieked, pacing frantically back and forth in front of me like a trapped animal. "I knew there was something deeply wrong with you the moment I met you. You are nothing but a glorified cook. You were just jealous. You were so incredibly jealous that Jamal married a beautiful, classy woman like Chloe, and you wanted to ruin her perfect life. You could not stand seeing her happy and successful in this magnificent house, so you decided to act like a common thug from the streets." I let out a very soft, quiet sigh. It was the only sound I made, but it was enough to cut through her hysterical ranting. She glared at me, her chest heaving violently as she tried to catch her breath. "Are you quite finished, Brenda?" I asked. My voice was incredibly calm, soft, and completely measured. I did not yell. I did not need to yell. The sheer volume of my composure was far more intimidating than any screaming match could ever be. I held all the cards, and she was playing with an empty deck. "Do not speak to me with that disgusting, condescending tone," she snapped back, though I could clearly see a tiny flicker of true uncertainty hiding behind her angry eyes. "I am calling the police right this very second. I am going to have you arrested for grand larceny. We will see exactly how calm you are when they put you in handcuffs and drag you out of here like the trash you are." She furiously dug into her designer handbag and pulled out her glowing smartphone. Her hands were shaking so badly that she almost dropped the device onto the floor. She aggressively tapped the screen, her thumb hovering over the numbers, to dial emergency services. Bradley stood firmly beside her, nodding his head in angry agreement, keeping his dark, furious eyes fixed entirely on me to ensure I did not try to make a run for the door. I slowly uncrossed my legs and reached down to the floor right beside my folding chair. I did not rush. I made sure my movements were deliberate, slow, and completely visible to them. I picked up the thick manila folder containing the devastating financial documents I had discovered hidden inside Chloe's vanity drawer. I held the folder in my hand for a brief moment, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the truth it contained. Brenda was already typing the first number onto her phone screen. I looked her right in the eyes and placed the folder onto the smooth hardwood floor. With a swift, calculated push of my foot, I slid the folder directly across the large room. The manila folder glided quickly over the bare floorboards, making a soft scraping sound in the quiet house, and came to a complete stop right against the tips of Brenda's expensive leather shoes. She stopped typing immediately. She looked down at the folder lying on the floor, then back up at me, her face twisting into a mask of deep, confused suspicion. "What is this garbage?" Brenda demanded, her voice dripping with pure venom and disgust. "Are you trying to hand me some kind of fake inventory list to justify your crimes? It is not going to work. The police are coming right now." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows comfortably on my knees. I looked directly into her angry, arrogant eyes, letting a completely cold, unforgiving silence hang heavily in the air for several long seconds. I wanted her to feel the absolute gravity of the moment before her entire carefully constructed world completely collapsed around her. "Before you dial 911, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting clearly through the quiet room like a freshly sharpened blade, "you might want to pick up that folder and see exactly how your precious daughter plans to pay off the $150,000 she stole directly from your personal retirement accounts." Brenda stared at the manila folder resting against her shoes, as if it were a highly unstable explosive. Her manicured hands were shaking as she hesitantly reached down to pick it up. She flipped open the plain cover, her eyes scanning the document inside. It was the joint retirement account statement showing the massive, unauthorized wire transfer made just days ago. The arrogant mask Brenda had worn proudly all evening instantly melted away, replaced by absolute horror. Bradley stepped closer and peered over her trembling shoulder. He snatched the paper directly from her hands, his brow furrowing as he mentally comprehended the string of numbers printed clearly on the page. I sat silently and watched his brain process the devastating financial information. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly. His chest instantly deflated as the wind was knocked out of his sails. He looked desperately from the bank statement to me, his mouth opening and closing silently. This was the stark reality of their precious daughter. Brenda stumbled backward, her sharp high heels catching awkwardly on the floorboards, and she nearly fell to the ground. She caught herself against the drywall, her breathing suddenly ragged and fast. She shook her head aggressively, refusing to accept the proof staring her in the face. "This is an elaborate forgery," she stammered, her voice weak and laced with pure panic. "Chloe would never do something like this to us. She has plenty of money. Jamal has plenty of money. They are both doing exceptionally well. You are just trying to frame her because you are insanely jealous of her and you absolutely hate us." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed loudly in the empty living room. "Jamal has money," I repeated slowly, shaking my head with deep disgust. "Brenda, your daughter has been feeding you a steady, calculated diet of absolute lies since the first day she met my stepson. She looked you directly in the eyes and told you he was a highly successful tech millionaire. She confidently told you his startup company was booming financially and that he generously bought this $2 million house for her as a lavish wedding gift." Brenda swallowed hard, completely unable to formulate any coherent response. I leaned forward slightly. "Jamal's tech startup went completely bankrupt over 8 months ago," I stated clearly, my voice ringing out through the empty house with absolute authority. "He does not have a single spare penny to his name right now. He absolutely does not own this house. He does not own the luxury custom furniture that used to fill this very room just a few hours ago. He does not even own the expensive imported cars currently parked in the garage outside. I own absolutely all of it. I personally bought this massive property entirely in cash through my corporate holding company to give him a safe place to live while he figured out his professional life. Your daughter married a young man with zero money, and she has been desperately pretending to be a wealthy socialite while secretly drowning in an inescapable ocean of her horrific financial ruin." I pointed a steady finger directly toward the manila folder Bradley was still clutching tightly. "Look closely at the other papers inside that folder, Bradley," I commanded him. "Look at the overdue credit card statements. Look at the deliberately forged commercial loan application. She is currently over $150,000 in severe credit card debt. She has been fully funding her exclusive country club lifestyle entirely on high-interest credit she cannot possibly repay. And when the aggressive creditors finally started closing in on her, she became truly desperate. She tried to take out a massive personal loan using my house as primary collateral and meticulously forged my stepson's signature to do it. But even that fraudulent attempt was not quite enough to save her sinking ship. She needed immediate cash to keep the ruthless collection agencies from completely freezing all of her bank accounts. So she ruthlessly hacked into your private joint retirement fund and stole your life savings. She stole directly from her own parents just so she could effortlessly continue to mock me at my own dinner table." Bradley flipped frantically through the rest of the thick documents hidden inside the manila folder. His breathing grew heavy, the sound echoing ominously in the cavernous space of the living room. He stared with horrified eyes at the credit card bills displaying staggering balances. He stared with absolute disgust at the carefully forged signature resting on the commercial loan application. The harsh reality of his daughter's massive deception washed over him in cold, unforgiving waves. He had worked his entire adult life, sacrificing his personal time and energy to build up that secure retirement nest egg, so he and his wife could live comfortably. He had proudly walked his beautiful daughter down the church aisle just 6 months ago, believing he had raised a successful, responsible woman. Now he was holding undeniable proof that his only daughter was a desperate con artist who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient bank account to blindly fund her pathetic illusions of grandeur. Bradley violently crushed the thick manila folder in his shaking hands. The veins in his neck were bulging visibly against the tight collar of his expensive dress shirt. He turned slowly to look directly at his wife. Brenda was sobbing quietly against the bare drywall, her shaking hands covering her tear-stained face. She knew deep down in her soul that every single word I said was true. She had always known her daughter was selfish and manipulative, but she chose to ignore the glaring warning signs because maintaining the public illusion of perfection was always more important to her than confronting the ugly truth. Bradley did not reach out to offer his devastated wife any physical comfort whatsoever. His fierce, burning anger had completely shifted away from me and was now squarely directed at the monster he had raised inside his own home. He looked slowly back at me, his dark eyes burning fiercely with a terrifying, unbridled intensity. "What exactly are you going to do about this?" he asked me, his voice a low, incredibly dangerous rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. He was genuinely asking for my strategic battle plan. He wanted to know exactly how this brutal execution was going to play out tonight. I stood slowly from the cold metal folding chair. I carefully smoothed the soft fabric of my dark dress, projecting complete calm in the face of their shattering world. "I have already canceled her access to absolutely everything I own," I said firmly, my voice echoing slightly in the bare room. "The moving trucks are unloading her fake life into a storage facility across town. She has nothing left. Tomorrow morning, my elite corporate attorney will formally submit this forged commercial loan application directly to federal authorities for full prosecution. She is going to face severe federal criminal charges for massive wire fraud and attempted bank fraud." I took a few slow, measured steps closer to where they were standing, deliberately closing the physical distance between us to deliver my final ultimatum. "So here is your only choice for tonight," I told them, my voice dropping to a quiet, deadly whisper. "You can turn around right now, walk straight out that front door, get into your car, and drive far away from here. You can completely wash your hands of this disastrous situation and pretend you never saw these legally damning documents. Or you can choose to stay right here in this empty, echoing house and watch your precious, entitled daughter face the devastating consequences of her horrific actions. You can stand here and watch her entire fake world violently collapse the exact moment she walks through that front door. The choice is yours, but if you stay, you will witness exactly what happens when someone foolishly tries to destroy my family." Bradley did not hesitate for a single second. His weathered face was a mask of cold, unforgiving rage. "We are absolutely staying right here," he growled fiercely, tossing the crumpled manila folder aggressively onto the bare floorboards. I want to look her directly in her lying eyes when she finally realizes she has lost everything. Brenda let out a pathetic whimpering cry, but she did not take a single step toward the door. She stayed completely frozen against the wall, utterly broken. Suddenly, a bright pair of headlights swept violently across the empty living room walls, cutting sharply through the absolute darkness. The loud rumble of an expensive sports car engine filled the quiet driveway outside. Heavy car doors slammed shut, echoing loudly in the cold night. Then the piercing sound of Chloe's loud, drunken laughter drifted clearly through the freezing autumn air, followed by Jamal's deeper voice. The extravagant party was over. They were home. The heavy sports car engine shut off, making the quiet suburban street feel more silent. Through the large windows, I watched the sleek vehicle sit in the dark driveway. The driver's side door swung open first, and Jamal stepped out into the freezing November air. He moved slowly, looking exhausted and drained. A few seconds later, the passenger door opened, and Chloe stumbled out onto the paved concrete. Even from inside the house, I could hear the sharp, unsteady clicking of her designer heels, echoing loudly in the quiet night. She slammed the car door shut with far too much force and began to complain. Her high-pitched voice cut through the cold air like a jagged knife. She complained loudly about the exclusive downtown club they had just left. She whined that the venue was entirely too crowded and that the management had played awful ghetto music all night long. She crossed her arms over her chest and shivered loudly, complaining that the valet took too long to bring their car around. She ranted about how the other people at the club were completely classless and how they had absolutely ruined her perfect Thanksgiving evening. She walked unsteadily up the long, winding driveway, completely absorbed in her own massive entitlement and fabricated grievances. Jamal walked a few steps behind her. He did not say a single word. He kept his head down, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive winter coat. He looked like a man carrying a massive, invisible weight on his shoulders. Perhaps some tiny, buried part of his conscience was finally whispering to him about how terribly he had treated me earlier that evening. But his silent guilt meant absolutely nothing to me now. He had made his choice when he sat at my dinner table and let this vicious woman humiliate me. Now he was going to face the brutal reality of the life he had chosen to defend. Chloe reached the large front porch and aggressively stomped her feet to shake off the cold. She dug clumsily into her small designer clutch purse, looking for her house keys. She muttered angrily under her breath about how freezing she was and how she desperately needed a hot bath in her massive custom soaking tub. She had absolutely no idea that her precious custom tub was currently sitting in the back of a moving truck on its way to a secure storage facility. She finally found her silver key and shoved it aggressively into the heavy brass deadbolt. She turned the key and pushed the massive wooden door open. She stepped inside the grand foyer, completely expecting to be greeted by the warm, inviting glow of her perfectly decorated luxury home. She expected to see the expensive silk rug beneath her feet and the custom mirrored console table against the wall. Instead, she stepped onto cold, bare hardwood floors. The heavy front door closed slowly behind Jamal, sealing them inside the house. Chloe reached out blindly to her right and flicked the main light switch. The large crystal chandelier above the entryway flickered to life, casting a bright, unforgiving light over the entire space. The sudden illumination revealed the absolute barren emptiness of the grand foyer. The silk rug was gone. The console table was gone. The large decorative mirrors had vanished, leaving behind nothing but small holes in the smooth, painted drywall. Chloe froze completely solid. Her hand remained hovering in the air right next to the light switch. The annoyed, drunken expression on her face instantly dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. She blinked rapidly several times as if trying to force her eyes to adjust to an impossible reality. She took one small, hesitant step forward into the empty hallway. Her expensive heel made a loud, sharp clacking sound that echoed violently against the bare walls. The sound bounced around the empty space, highlighting the absolute lack of furniture to absorb the noise. Jamal walked up right behind her and stopped dead in his tracks. He stared down the long, empty hallway, his jaw dropping slightly. He rubbed his tired eyes and shook his head, clearly struggling to comprehend what he was looking at. The house felt completely different. It was cold, hollow, and completely stripped of its fabricated soul. It looked exactly like a house that had just been abandoned by its owners in the middle of the night. "What is going on?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling slightly as the first waves of true panic began to wash over her. "Where is the entryway table?" She walked slowly past the staircase and turned the corner to enter the massive open-concept living room. She expected to see her beautiful velvet sectionals and her massive flat-screen television. She expected to see the warm, comfortable space she used to show off her fake wealth to all of her jealous friends. But as she stepped into the living room, her breath caught violently in her throat. The entire room was a vast, empty cavern. The moonlight spilled through the bare, uncurtained windows, illuminating the stark reality of her situation. Every single piece of luxury furniture was entirely gone. The designer lamps, the modern art, the heavy coffee tables, everything had been meticulously removed. The room was so incredibly empty that it felt hostile. But the room was not entirely empty. Right in the dead center of the massive bare floorboards sat a single cheap gray metal folding table. The table looked incredibly out of place in the grand architecture of the $2 million home. And right in the middle of that cheap folding table was a single plate of food. It was a beautiful antique gold-rimmed china plate holding a perfectly arranged portion of leftover roasted turkey truffle macaroni and cheese and sweet potato soufflé. I was sitting calmly on a matching gray metal folding chair placed squarely behind the table. I was wearing my simple, elegant black dress, my posture perfectly straight and completely relaxed. I rested my hands gracefully on my lap and looked directly at her. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply watched her world completely shatter. Standing rigidly on my left side was her mother, Brenda. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she was clutching her expensive coat tightly against her chest. Standing firmly on my right side was her father, Bradley. His face was a mask of cold, hard, unforgiving fury. They stood beside me like silent executioners, ready to deliver the final, fatal blow to their daughter's web of lies. Chloe stood completely paralyzed at the edge of the living room. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish suffocating on dry land. She looked at the bare walls, then at the cheap folding table, then at the plate of Thanksgiving leftovers. Her eyes finally locked onto my calm face, then slowly drifted to the furious faces of her own parents standing right beside me. Jamal walked up beside her and let out a loud gasp of absolute shock. He looked around the barren room, his eyes wide with complete disbelief. He looked at me sitting behind the folding table, and his face twisted into an expression of profound confusion and rising fear. He had absolutely no idea what was happening, but he knew instantly that he was completely powerless to stop it. The arrogant, condescending woman who had commanded me to eat scraps just a few hours ago was now staring at the exact physical manifestation of her own horrific actions. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that occurs right before a massive explosion levels an entire city block. Chloe finally found her voice, her face completely drained of all its color, turning a sickly pale white. She began to physically shake from head to toe. She pointed a trembling finger wildly around the empty room, her voice rising into a hysterical, panicked shriek. "We have been robbed!" she stammered loudly, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. "Someone broke in and completely robbed us. Jamal, call the police right now." They took absolutely everything we own." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows softly on the cheap metal folding table. I looked down at the perfectly plated Thanksgiving leftovers resting right in front of me. I slowly reached out and picked up a crystal water glass that I had deliberately kept behind. I brought the cool glass to my lips and took a very slow, measured sip of water. I swallowed quietly, letting the crushing silence stretch out for another agonizing second. I placed the crystal glass gently back down onto the metal table. I looked directly into Chloe's panicked, terrified eyes. My voice was perfectly calm, steady, and as cold as solid ice. "No, Chloe," I replied softly, my words echoing clearly through the massive empty house. "You have been evicted." The word evicted hung in the freezing air like a heavy, dark cloud. Chloe stared at me with her mouth hanging open, completely unable to process the reality of my statement. Her brain simply could not comprehend that the woman she had treated like a worthless servant for the past 6 months was currently holding the absolute power to destroy her entire life. When the shock finally wore off, it was immediately replaced by a frantic, wild rage. She turned her body violently toward Jamal, her hands curling into tight fists at her sides. She began to scream at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. "Jamal," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Do you hear what this crazy woman is saying to me? She has completely lost her mind. She broke into our beautiful house while we were gone, and she hired some thugs to steal all of my expensive things. She is sitting there making completely psychotic threats. I want you to go over there and drag her out of my house right now. I want you to physically throw her out onto the street where she belongs. Hit her if you have to just get her out of my sight." She was literally commanding my stepson to physically attack me. She was so blinded by her own arrogance that she genuinely believed she could order him to assault the mother who had raised him just to protect her stolen throne. Jamal did not move to attack me. He stood frozen in the center of the bare living room, looking back and forth between his furious wife and my perfectly calm expression. The heavy silence of the empty house made her screaming sound even more unhinged. Jamal finally took a heavy step forward, his expensive shoes scraping loudly against the bare hardwood floorboards. He looked like a man waking up from a very long, very deep sleep, only to find himself in the middle of a terrifying nightmare. He looked at the cheap metal folding table. He looked at the single plate of leftover turkey and macaroni and cheese. He looked at Brenda and Bradley standing silently beside me, their faces etched with cold, unforgiving anger. His eyes finally met mine, and I could see the absolute confusion and rising panic swirling in his dark pupils. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking slightly as he struggled to find the right words. "What is going on here? Why is the house completely empty? Where is all of our furniture? Where are the televisions and the rugs and the beds? Chloe is saying you packed everything up, but that makes absolutely no sense. This is our house. My name is on the deed. You gave this to us as a wedding present. You told me this was my fresh start. I need you to explain to me right now where you put all of our stuff, because none of this is making any sense." He was pleading with me to give him an answer that would make his comfortable world make sense again. He wanted me to tell him this was all just a massive misunderstanding or some kind of bizarre practical joke. He desperately wanted to go back to the luxurious life he thought he owned. But I was not here to comfort him tonight. I was here to violently wake him up from the dangerous delusion he had been living in. I reached calmly down to the floor beside my metal chair and picked up the thick manila folder that Bradley had aggressively tossed aside just moments ago. I placed the heavy manila folder squarely on the cheap metal folding table right next to the plate of Thanksgiving leftovers. I opened the cover and deliberately bypassed the credit card statements and the forged loan documents. I would save those for later. Instead, I pulled out a single crisp, legal document printed on heavy ivory paper. It was the official recorded deed to the Oakwood property. I held the document up in the dim light of the living room so Jamal could see the official county seals stamped at the top. "I did not give you this house as a wedding present, Jamal," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the massive, empty cavern of the living room. "I told you that you could live in this house rent-free while you built your future. I bought this property entirely in cash, but I never once put your name on the deed." I handed the heavy ivory paper across the folding table. Jamal reached out with a trembling hand and took the document. He stared down at the bold black ink printed across the page. "Read the name of the legal owner, Jamal," I commanded softly. "Read it out loud so your wife can hear exactly who owns the floor she is currently standing on." Jamal swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He read the words aloud, his voice barely more than a terrified whisper. "Nia Holdings Limited Liability Corporation." Chloe let out a sharp gasp of pure horror. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth as the devastating reality finally pierced through her thick wall of denial. I reached back into the manila folder and pulled out a thick stack of printed commercial invoices. I slid them across the metal table toward my stepson. "These are the commercial lease agreements for every single piece of luxury furniture that was inside this house," I explained calmly. "The custom velvet sectionals, the hand-carved bedroom sets, the modern art hanging on the walls, and the expensive rugs on the floors. All of it was leased by my corporate entity. I own the corporate account that pays the monthly invoices. I even own the corporate lease agreements for the 2 luxury cars currently parked in the garage outside. You own absolutely none of it. You never did. You were living inside a beautiful bubble that I completely funded, and I decided it was time to pop it." Jamal stared blindly at the massive stack of commercial invoices resting in his shaking hands. The color completely drained from his face as he realized his entire identity as a wealthy, successful man was nothing but a fragile illusion carefully maintained by my generosity. He slowly turned his head to look at Chloe. The look of absolute disgust and betrayal forming in his eyes was undeniable. Chloe was backing away slowly, her designer heels clicking frantically against the bare wood, as if she were trying to escape an invisible predator. She bumped hard into the wall and stood there trapped like a cornered animal. She looked at her parents, hoping they would step forward and defend her honor. But Brenda simply turned her face away, unable to look at her own daughter, and Bradley maintained his terrifying mask of silent, furious judgment. They knew the truth, and they were going to let her burn. I kept my eyes locked directly onto Chloe's pale, terrified face. I slowly gestured toward the single plate of food resting on the cheap metal table between us. "Earlier tonight you sent me a text message while I was standing in your kitchen cleaning up your massive mess," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "You told me to eat all the leftovers because I was used to eating scraps anyway. You thought you could treat me like a worthless servant in a house that I personally bought and paid for. You thought your white skin and your fake social status gave you the absolute right to degrade a black woman who literally built the roof over your head." I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the devastating weight of my next words. "Well, Chloe, I decided to take your advice. I decided to pack up absolutely everything else in this entire house so I would have plenty of room for those leftovers." The finality of my statement struck Chloe like a physical blow. The arrogant facade she had worn for 6 months completely shattered into a million pieces. She realized she had absolutely no power, no money, and no escape. She immediately resorted to her ultimate manipulation tactic. She squeezed her eyes shut and forced massive, fake, hysterical tears to stream down her face. She let out a loud, dramatic wail that echoed in the empty room. She ran across the bare floorboards and threw her arms around Jamal's neck, hiding her body behind his shoulders. She sobbed loudly, pressing her face against his coat, playing the terrified victim with absolute perfection. "Jamal, please, you have to do something," she cried out, her voice shaking with fabricated terror. "You cannot let her do this to us. She is a complete monster." "Jamal, do something quickly. She is trying to put your pregnant wife out on the incredibly cold, freezing winter street completely alone and without a home." The words pregnant wife hung in the freezing air of the empty living room like a massive physical weight. The entire space went completely dead silent. It was a suffocating quiet that pressed heavily against my eardrums, making the distant howling of the winter wind outside sound absolutely deafening. Up until that exact second, Jamal had been reeling from the initial shock of learning he owned absolutely nothing. He had been staring at the commercial invoices and the property deed with the look of a broken man watching his entire life completely unravel before his tired eyes. But the moment Chloe screamed those two specific words, everything in the room instantly shifted. It was as if a powerful electric current had been suddenly injected directly into his veins, waking him from a deep trance. I watched his physical demeanor transform right in front of me in real time. The confused, terrified boy, who had just realized he was living a complete financial lie, suddenly vanished entirely. In his place stood a man violently activated by a deeply ingrained biological instinct to protect his vulnerable unborn child. His posture completely changed. His shoulders squared broadly and his spine went completely rigid. He pushed Chloe gently but firmly behind his broad back, using his own body as a physical shield against me. I sat perfectly still on the cheap metal folding chair and watched this sudden transformation take place. I could see the raw, desperate anger rapidly flooding into Jamal's dark eyes. He was breathing incredibly heavily, his chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic movements that betrayed his absolute panic. The fear that Chloe had successfully injected into his mind had completely overridden his logical thought process. He was no longer thinking about the forged loan documents hidden in my folder or the stolen retirement funds or the undeniable fact that his name was nowhere on the deed to the massive house. He was only thinking about the fabricated baby his manipulative wife had just weaponized against me to save herself. He took a heavy, aggressive step forward, completely closing the physical distance between us. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his hand trembling violently with unbridled rage. He did not care that I had spent the last 13 years sacrificing my own youth to raise him into a man. He did not care that I had fully funded his college education, his luxury lifestyle, and his massive, extravagant wedding. He only cared about the desperate narrative Chloe had just spun out of thin air. "Mom, you have gone entirely too far this time," he shouted, his voice echoing harshly against the bare drywall of the empty living room. His voice was thick with a volatile mixture of absolute fury and deep emotional pain. "I cannot believe you would do something like this to us tonight. I cannot believe you would be this incredibly cruel and vindictive to your own family. Chloe is pregnant. She is carrying my child. She is carrying your future grandchild, and you are sitting here calmly trying to throw her out onto the freezing street in the middle of the dark night. You are intentionally trying to stress her out to the breaking point. You are intentionally trying to put my unborn baby in extreme physical danger just to prove some kind of sick, twisted point about money and property ownership." He was yelling so loudly that the thick veins in his neck were visibly bulging against his skin. He was completely buying into her sociopathic theatrical performance. Behind his back, Chloe was continuing to sob loudly, burying her face deeply into his expensive winter coat, playing the role of the terrified, helpless victim to absolute perfection. She was using a fake unborn child as a literal human shield to protect herself from the devastating consequences of her own massive financial crimes. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, aggressive energy. I did not stand up from my metal folding chair to physically intimidate him. I simply looked at the young man I had lovingly raised and felt a profound, deep-seated sadness wash over my entire soul. I had spent countless exhausted nights staying awake to help him finish his difficult school projects. I had attended every single one of his sporting events, cheering much louder than anyone else in the crowded bleachers. I had held him tightly while he cried uncontrollably at his own father's tragic funeral, promising him that I would always protect him and make sure he had a beautiful, secure life. And now he was standing right here in a luxury house I bought with my own hard-earned money, screaming at me in blind defense of a vicious woman who had just tried to completely destroy his financial future. "You are acting like a complete monster," Jamal continued, his voice cracking slightly under the immense emotional strain of the intense moment. "We were going to joyfully announce the pregnancy tomorrow morning. We were going to make it a beautiful surprise for everyone at brunch, and instead you maliciously broke into our home and stole all of our furniture like a common street criminal. You are actively trying to ruin our family. You are trying to destroy the only good thing we have going for us right now." He paused for a brief second to catch his breath, his chest heaving heavily in the cold air. The absolute silence stretched out thick and suffocating around us. He glared down at me, his dark eyes filled with a level of pure burning hatred I had never seen directed at me before. He was slowly preparing to deliver the final devastating blow. He was calculating how to say the one specific thing he knew would inflict the maximum amount of emotional damage on my heart. He squared his broad shoulders, looked me directly in the eyes, and completely severed the deep loving bond we had shared for over a decade. "My dad would be absolutely ashamed of you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly register that cut through the cold air like a freshly sharpened blade. "My dad was an incredibly good, honest man who loved his family much more than anything else in the entire world. He would never treat people like this no matter what they did. He would be completely disgusted to see the cold, heartless woman you have become today. You are entirely obsessed with money and control, and you are trying to destroy my happiness because you are miserable and lonely. Get out of my house right now. Get out of my house and never come back here again." The sheer level of absolute delusion required to look directly at the legal owner of a property and command them to get out of their own house was absolutely staggering to witness. He was literally holding the official recorded deed in his shaking hand just moments ago, but his desperate, pathetic need to believe Chloe's vicious lies had completely blinded him to objective reality. The cruel invocation of his late father was meant to entirely break my spirit. It was meant to make me crumble into a weeping, broken mess and apologize profusely for my defensive actions. It was meant to make me surrender completely to their toxic demands and hand over the keys to the massive kingdom I had built with my own two hands. He thought the painful memory of the incredible man I loved would be my ultimate emotional weakness. But Jamal had fundamentally miscalculated the entire situation. He thought he was speaking to a weak, guilty woman who relied heavily on the approval of others to validate her simple existence. He did not realize he was speaking to a resilient woman who had already successfully mourned the deepest loss imaginable and had spent the last 5 years quietly building an impenetrable fortress of emotional and financial power. I knew exactly what his amazing father would think of this specific situation because his father and I had built our entire lives together on the solid foundation of radical honesty and relentless hard work. We had scrubbed dirty floors together. We had balanced complicated ledgers until the sun came up, and we had promised each other that we would never let anyone take advantage of our family legacy. His father would have been absolutely horrified to see his only son acting like a cowardly fool, blindly defending a manipulative con artist who had just forged his signature on a fraudulent commercial loan application. His father would have been incredibly proud of me for standing my ground protecting the family assets and refusing to become a silent, pathetic victim in my own home. I did not flinch or look away from his angry gaze. I did not shed a single dramatic tear. I did not offer a single word of defense or justification for my calculated actions. I simply sat there completely motionless, calmly absorbing the full, devastating impact of his massive, unforgivable betrayal. I let his cruel words hang heavily in the freezing air, letting him sit with the absolute gravity of what he had just chosen to do. He had explicitly chosen Chloe over me. He had explicitly chosen the deceitful woman who constantly lied to him, manipulated his emotions, and tried to steal everything he would ever own over the loyal mother who had actually built his entire world from the ground up. The emotional transaction between us was completely finished. I owed him absolutely nothing more from this day forward. I slowly shifted my calm gaze away from Jamal's angry face. I looked directly past his protective stance and focused my attention entirely on the older woman standing just a few feet away from me. I looked directly at Brenda Chloe's wealthy, arrogant mother. Throughout Jamal's entire explosive emotional outburst, Brenda had remained entirely silent and still. She had not rushed forward to comfort her loudly crying daughter. She had not joined Jamal in screaming insults at me. She had been standing completely frozen against the bare-painted drywall of the empty living room, staring directly at Chloe with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror painted across her pale, wrinkled face. The haughty, confident older woman who had openly mocked my natural hair and my successful career earlier that evening was completely gone. In her place was a broken, devastated mother who was watching the final remaining pieces of her daughter's carefully constructed facade violently crumble into fine dust. Brenda's hands were shaking so violently that she had actually dropped her expensive designer handbag onto the bare floorboards without even noticing the loud thud it made. Her eyes were incredibly wide and completely fixated on the side of Chloe's head. Her breathing was incredibly shallow and rapid, as if she were suffocating in the large room. She had read the terrible bank statements I provided. She knew all about the massive stolen retirement funds. She knew all about the staggering overdue credit card debt. She knew her daughter was a desperate lying thief who preyed on her own family. But the sudden, hysterical public announcement of a fake pregnancy was the absolute breaking point for her mind. It was the final undeniable proof that her daughter was a complete, dangerous sociopath, entirely willing to say or do absolutely anything to escape the immediate consequences of her horrific criminal actions. The heavy, suffocating silence slowly returned to the massive room as Jamal's angry echoes finally faded away into the cold night air. He stood tall and protective, his chin raised in a gesture of absolute defiance, still waiting for me to react to his brutal, unforgiving words. He fully expected me to stand up from the cheap metal chair, gather my things, and leave the property in absolute shame. He expected me to retreat into the dark shadows and allow him to continue living his beautiful, comfortable lie. But I simply sat there completely unbothered by his theatrical display of misplaced masculine protection. I kept my eyes locked securely on Brenda, watching the terrible realization wash completely over her shattered mind. The room was so perfectly quiet that I could clearly hear the rapid, frantic beating of Chloe's heart as she pressed herself tightly against Jamal's chest. She was still burying her face in his thick winter coat, sobbing loudly, and pretending to be completely traumatized by my mere presence. She genuinely believed her ultimate manipulation tactic had worked perfectly. She genuinely believed she had successfully weaponized Jamal against me and secured her permanent place in the luxury house. She was completely confident that the powerful magic words of an unborn child would completely shield her from the devastating consequences of her massive financial fraud. Then Brenda finally moved from her spot against the wall. She took one slow, halting step forward, her expensive leather heels scraping softly against the bare hardwood floor. She did not look at me at all. She did not look at Jamal. She kept her terrified, horrified eyes locked entirely on her lying daughter. She slowly raised a trembling hand and pointed a shaking finger directly at Chloe's back. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the loud, demanding, arrogant shriek she had used earlier to threaten me with the police. It was a weak, breathy whisper that somehow managed to carry perfectly across the silent, empty expanse of the massive living room. It was the devastating sound of a mother completely mourning the living, breathing monster she had brought into the world. Chloe Brenda whispered, her voice cracking heavily with deep, devastating sorrow and absolute disbelief. "What on earth are you talking about right now? Stop lying to this poor boy this very instant." The words seemed to physically drain the remaining life out of her frail body. Jamal frowned, completely confused by this sudden, strange interruption. He turned his head slightly to look at his wealthy mother-in-law, fully expecting her to join him in aggressively defending her pregnant daughter. But Brenda just slowly shook her head, heavy tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and running rapidly down her pale cheeks. She took another shaky step forward, completely destroying the final illusion her daughter had desperately tried to maintain for so long. Chloe Brenda whispered again, her voice echoing softly with the heavy, devastating weight of absolute truth. "You cannot possibly be pregnant tonight. You had your tubes tied 3 years ago." The words "pregnant wife" hung in the freezing air of the empty living room like a massive physical weight. The entire space went completely dead silent. It was a suffocating quiet that pressed heavily against my eardrums, making the distant howling of the winter wind outside sound absolutely deafening. Chloe had successfully weaponized Jamal against me. She used a fake unborn child as a literal human shield to protect herself from the devastating consequences of her massive financial crimes. I sat perfectly still on the cheap metal folding chair and watched the chaotic scene unfolding right in front of me. The phrase "you had your tubes tied 3 years ago" echoed in the massive empty living room. Chloe whipped her head around to look directly at her mother. The fake tears completely vanished from her pale face in an instant. Her eyes went incredibly wide with a terrifying mixture of absolute fury and desperate panic. "Mom, shut your mouth right now," she hissed violently, her voice completely devoid of the sweet, innocent tone she had used just seconds before. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You are completely confused and you need to leave immediately tonight." But Brenda did not back down at all. She stood her ground firmly against the bare drywall, her face heavily stained with tears, looking at the terrible stranger she had raised. Jamal looked rapidly back and forth between the two women, his brain struggling deeply to process this impossible new information. He took a slow, heavy step away from Chloe, creating a necessary physical distance between them. He looked down at her, his face a vivid picture of pure, utter devastation. "What is she talking about, Chloe?" he asked, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Tell me she is lying right now. Tell me you are really pregnant," Jamal begged, his voice cracking loudly. Chloe reached out frantically to grab his arm, but he quickly pulled away from her touch. "Jamal, baby, please listen to me," she cried, her voice returning to the high-pitched, hysterical whine. "My mother is going completely crazy. She is just insanely jealous of our beautiful, perfect life. I am carrying your baby, I swear it. I would never lie to you about something so incredibly important." She tried to step closer to him again, but he held up his hand firmly to stop her advance forever. The deep seed of absolute doubt had finally been planted securely in his shattered mind. I knew it was the absolute perfect moment to deliver the final crushing blow to her elaborate, wicked web of deception. I reached my right hand calmly back into the thick manila folder, resting squarely on the metal table. I did not need to yell or scream loudly to take absolute control of the entire room. I simply pulled out a small, neat stack of crisp, white medical receipts I had personally found hidden away at the very bottom of her secret vanity makeup drawer. I placed the medical receipts squarely on the metal table right next to the forged commercial loan application and the official property deed. "Your mother is not crazy, Chloe," I said, my voice remaining completely steady and completely cold. "And you are certainly not pregnant tonight." I slid the small stack of white papers slowly across the metal table directly toward my terrified stepson. "Take a very close look at these official documents," Jamal, I instructed him quietly. I found them hidden deeply inside a secret wooden compartment inside her custom expensive makeup vanity while my elite moving crew worked. Jamal stepped forward hesitantly and picked up the small white papers. His large hands were shaking so badly that the thin papers rustled loudly in the completely silent room. He stared intensely at the printed black ink, his dark eyes darting quickly back and forth across the detailed page. "These are not medical receipts for standard prenatal care." I continued calmly, my voice echoing softly against the bare painted drywall. "They are official receipts for a permanent surgical procedure completed exactly 3 years ago. Just like your devastated mother bravely stated to us a few short, painful moments ago tonight. And directly beneath those specific surgical documents are recent pharmacy receipts for strong daily birth control pills," I added firmly. "She has been secretly taking them every single day since you two originally got married 6 months ago. She has been cruelly pretending to try for a baby, just to permanently lock you down and secure her permanent position in this massive luxury house. She deliberately used your deep, desperate desire to become a loving father as a twisted, dark psychological weapon to completely manipulate your feelings and entirely control your actions behind your back for all these long months. Jamal stared blindly at the medical receipts until his vision completely blurred with fresh, hot tears. The horrific, ugly reality of Chloe's massive sociopathic manipulation crashed violently over him like a massive, suffocating ocean wave. Everything he previously thought he knew about his beautiful, perfect wife was a meticulously crafted, wicked illusion. The devastating fast cascade of absolute deep betrayal completely flooded his previously sheltered, shattered mind. The innocent pregnancy was a complete, bold lie fabricated entirely out of thin air, just to desperately save herself from immediate legal eviction from my expensive, beautiful suburban luxury home this very night. The massive money she constantly bragged about was a complete lie, entirely funded by stolen family retirement accounts and massive secret credit card debt. The huge house he mistakenly thought he owned was a complete lie, built entirely on my silent generosity and her forged illegal signatures. He slowly lowered the undeniable medical receipts, looking directly at the terrible woman standing just a few feet away from him. He finally saw her exactly as she truly physically was. She was a hollow, vicious, selfish parasite who ruthlessly fed entirely on the pure love and blind trust of generous, innocent people. Jamal abruptly dropped the medical receipts directly onto the bare, cold hardwood floorboards. He let out a deep, agonizing, loud groan of pure, raw, emotional pain that echoed terribly in the empty, dark cavern of the large living room. He aggressively ran his shaking hands over his tired face, roughly pulling at his short, dark hair. "How could you ever do this to me?" he whispered, his deep voice breaking heavily with complete, total devastation. "I loved you deeply with my entire trusting heart. I boldly defended you against my own loving, loyal family members earlier this exact same evening." Chloe stood completely frozen solidly in the center of the large, barren room. She looked quickly at Jamal, crying loudly against the far wall. She looked directly at her wealthy mother, weeping silently near the grand entryway. She looked nervously at her tall father, staring right at her with cold, absolute, unforgiving, deep disgust. And finally, she looked directly at me, sitting perfectly calmly behind the cheap gray metal table. She fully realized in that exact terrifying moment that the long game was entirely, completely over, forever. The sweet, innocent, helpless act had failed completely and totally tonight, without question. The completely cornered woman suddenly dropped her fake victim narrative totally. The frantic, terrified, innocent expression on her pale face instantly completely vanished without a trace. Her physical posture straightened up aggressively, and her blue eyes narrowed tightly into two dark, hateful, angry slits. She let out a loud, incredibly harsh bark of cruel, evil laughter that sounded completely demonic in the massive, empty, echoing house. "Fine," she shouted loudly, her high-pitched voice completely dropping its previous fake whine and suddenly taking on an incredibly nasty, vicious, dangerous, sharp edge that deeply shocked everyone standing in the silent room. "You want the absolute ugly truth tonight?" Chloe screamed wildly. "I never actually loved you, Jamal. You are incredibly weak and totally pathetic and incredibly easy to completely manipulate. I only legally married you because I falsely thought you were an incredibly rich, successful tech millionaire." She then turned her furious, hateful, wild gaze directly toward me, sitting quietly. "You are absolutely nothing but a common, arrogant ghetto cook who got incredibly, incredibly lucky," she screamed violently. "I absolutely fully deserve this massive, expensive luxury house as fair payment for having to personally tolerate your entire totally classless, arrogant family." She quickly, aggressively reached deep into her small, expensive designer leather clutch purse and rapidly pulled out her expensive, bright, glowing smartphone. She pressed the glowing phone incredibly tightly directly against her ear. The vicious, hateful, screaming, racist monster completely vanished, and the terrified, helpless, innocent victim instantly, totally returned. "Hello?" she cried out loudly into the phone receiver, her voice shaking perfectly with perfectly, totally fabricated, pure terror. "Yes, please. I desperately need emergency police help right now immediately. I am completely trapped inside my own beautiful home by totally crazy people who are threatening to severely hurt me." The sharp click of the phone ending the emergency call echoed terribly in the massive empty living room. Chloe stood near the grand entryway, clutching the expensive glowing smartphone tightly to her chest as if it were a vital physical lifeline. She had just falsely reported a violent hostage situation to the local authorities, fully intending to have me arrested. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed her outrageous, bold lie was quickly broken by the faint, distant wail of police sirens cutting sharply through the freezing November night air. The high-pitched sound started as a very low, distant hum and slowly grew much louder and more incredibly insistent with every single passing second. Jamal did not even bother to look up when the loud sirens began to wail down the street. He had completely collapsed onto the bare, cold hardwood floorboards, entirely defeated. He sat with his long legs pulled up tightly against his chest, his heavy head resting completely in his hands. He looked exactly like a broken man who had just miraculously survived a massive, horrific train crash, only to realize he had lost absolutely everything he ever truly loved in the terrible wreckage. His broad shoulders shook slightly in the cold air, but he made absolutely no sound at all. The devastating, harsh reality of the fake pregnancy medical documents and the massive stolen financial funds had completely broken his gentle spirit and drained absolutely all the remaining fight out of his strong body. He was entirely trapped inside his own completely shattered mind, completely unable to properly process the sheer magnitude of his wife and her terrifying sociopathic betrayal against his family. I remained sitting perfectly still on my cheap gray metal folding chair, completely unbothered by the approaching authorities. I did not attempt to run away into the night or quickly hide the devastating financial documents. I simply kept my hands resting calmly on the smooth metal table right next to the single plate of leftover Thanksgiving food. I fully knew the police were coming rapidly, and I was entirely prepared for their dramatic arrival. Chloe began to pace frantically back and forth across the bare wooden floorboards of the grand foyer like a trapped wild animal. The sharp, rapid clicking of her expensive designer heels created a chaotic, stressful, rhythmic beat that perfectly matched the rising, intense panic filling the large room. She was no longer looking at her devastated husband Jamal or her completely horrified parents standing nearby. She was completely focused, entirely on herself and her incredibly desperate, calculated plan to completely escape the severe legal consequences of her massive financial actions. I quietly watched her thin lips moving silently as she paced back and forth in the shadows. She was actively, carefully rehearsing the completely fabricated innocent victim narrative she fully planned to feed the police officers the very moment they finally walked through the open front door. She was carefully, meticulously choosing her exact specific words, trying desperately to figure out exactly how to sound as completely helpless and terribly terrified as humanly possible. She reached her shaking hands up and deliberately, violently messed up her perfectly styled, expensive blonde hair, making it look incredibly wild and totally unkempt for the officers. She rubbed her blue eyes aggressively with her knuckles until they were incredibly red and very puffy, actively forcing more fake salty tears to spill rapidly down her pale cheeks. She was physically, violently transforming her entire appearance into the absolute perfect picture of a completely innocent, physically abused, helpless woman. Brenda watched her own daughter performing this sick, twisted, dark theatrical rehearsal with a deep look of absolute, sheer, complete horror on her face. The wealthy older woman had completely stopped weeping and was now simply staring blankly at Chloe as if she were looking at a terrifying, incredibly dangerous alien creature wearing her daughter's skin. Bradley stood completely rigidly right next to his quiet wife, his strong jaw locked tightly in a very tight, furious, dark scowl. He crossed his thick, muscular arms tightly over his broad chest, absolutely refusing to intervene or offer his lying daughter any physical or emotional help whatsoever tonight. He was a very proud, highly successful businessman, and he absolutely, completely refused to be violently dragged down into his daughter's massive, deep criminal web of dark lies. They both fully knew she was about to lie directly to sworn law enforcement officers, but neither of them made a single tiny move to stop her terrible actions. The wailing, loud sirens grew incredibly deafening, piercing sharply through the thick glass of the large living room windows. Bright, flashing red and blue police lights suddenly swept violently across the bare, painted drywall of the entirely empty house, casting very long, terrifying dark shadows across the cold room. The heavy, loud sound of thick tires crunching incredibly aggressively on the gravel driveway outside signaled the rapid arrival of multiple police cruisers responding to the fake emergency. Heavy car doors slammed incredibly heavily in the freezing cold night air, followed immediately by the loud sound of heavy black boots running very rapidly up the concrete steps to the large front porch. The massive, heavy wooden front door had been left slightly completely open after Chloe and Jamal entered earlier, and it now swung open completely forcefully, revealing two very large uniformed police officers standing squarely on the bright threshold. They looked incredibly tense and highly alert, their strong hands resting very close to the heavy black leather utility belts at their waists. They had received a frantic, terrifying emergency call about a highly violent active hostage situation, and they were completely, totally prepared for a very dangerous physical armed confrontation inside the dark house. The very moment the two tall officers stepped into the bright, artificial light of the grand foyer, Chloe immediately rapidly launched her desperate, twisted theatrical performance. She let out an incredibly loud, horrific, piercing scream that sounded exactly like a deeply wounded, dying animal, and sprinted directly, rapidly toward the two confused police officers. She threw her entire body wildly at the closest taller officer, violently grabbing his dark blue uniform shirt with her violently shaking pale hands. She quickly buried her messy face deeply into his broad chest, sobbing incredibly uncontrollably, and shaking violently from her head down to her expensive toes. "Please help me!" she wailed incredibly loudly, her high-pitched voice cracking perfectly with perfectly fabricated, absolute pure terror. "Thank God you are finally here tonight to save me. I truly, honestly thought they were going to violently kill me right here on this hard wooden floor." The tall police officer looked incredibly, totally confused, and immediately placed his large, strong hands firmly on her shaking shoulders, trying desperately to gently push her back to properly visually assess the chaotic, dark situation. He looked rapidly around the completely barren, massive living room, his sharp eyes sweeping quickly over the bare painted walls and the complete, utter lack of any normal household furniture. Chloe absolutely, totally refused to let go of his dark blue uniform shirt, crying even harder into the dark fabric. She quickly turned her blonde head and pointed a violently shaking, accusatory finger directly straight at me, sitting perfectly calmly behind the small gray metal table. "That crazy, dangerous woman violently broke into my beautiful, expensive house tonight," she screamed hysterically, heavy, fake tears streaming rapidly down her pale face. She brought a massive, terrifying gang of huge, strong men with her, and they violently, aggressively robbed us while we were gone at a party. They literally stole absolutely every single piece of custom expensive furniture we own in the entire world. They stole my incredibly expensive designer clothes and my custom diamond jewelry and my very large flat-screen television. She then quickly pointed her violently shaking finger down at Jamal, who was still sitting completely catatonic, freezing on the floorboards, entirely, totally unresponsive to the incredibly loud, chaotic commotion happening right above his head. "And my completely abusive husband is completely, totally in on the whole entire criminal thing," she cried out, her sharp voice echoing incredibly loudly against the bare drywall. "He is actively, willingly helping her completely terrorize me tonight in my own home. They completely, totally cornered me in this empty, dark room and aggressively told me they were going to severely physically hurt me if I tried to leave the property or call for any outside help. You absolutely have to arrest both of them right now, immediately, before they kill me. They are highly dangerous, violently aggressive criminal people, and I am completely, totally terrified for my very own life." She sobbed much, much louder violently, clutching the uncomfortable officer's uniform shirt, as if her entire fragile life truly completely depended on his immediate physical armed protection. The two highly trained police officers immediately quickly shifted their entire physical visual focus directly straight toward me and Jamal sitting quietly in the cold room. The second, slightly shorter officer took a very slow, highly calculated step forward into the massive dark living room, his right hand dropping incredibly firmly to rest directly completely on the hard black grip of his loaded service weapon. He carefully scanned the entire large room, looking rapidly for any hidden, immediate physical threats or other dangerous armed people lurking quietly in the dark shadows. He looked down at Jamal sitting completely helplessly on the cold floor, and then he locked his incredibly sharp, highly suspicious professional gaze entirely squarely on me, sitting calmly at the folding table. I did not move a single tiny muscle in my entire perfectly still body. I did not suddenly raise my empty hands defensively or loudly attempt to aggressively argue with Chloe's completely ridiculous, frantic, wild, false accusations. I simply quietly maintained my perfectly straight, elegant posture, keeping my empty hands totally, completely visible, resting completely flat on the cold gray metal table right next to the thick, heavy manila folder of devastating financial documents. "Mom, I need you to stand up very slowly right now and keep your empty hands exactly where I can clearly see them," the serious officer commanded, his deep voice full of absolute, complete, unwavering professional authority. He carefully took another cautious, heavy step directly toward me, fully preparing to physically aggressively detain me, based entirely solely on the hysterical, wild accusations of the lying, completely manipulative woman currently hiding cowardly behind his bewildered, tall partner. The heavy, dark tension in the massive, empty, echoing room was incredibly thick and completely, entirely suffocating, making it incredibly hard for anyone to even properly breathe. Chloe quickly peeked out from behind the first tall officer, a tiny, incredibly wicked, dark smirk of absolute, pure, total victory briefly, quickly flashing across her wet, messy, tear-stained face. She genuinely, completely believed she had finally successfully, entirely weaponized the local police department against me and permanently, completely won the entire long, bitter war tonight. Just as the armed officer took one more deliberate heavy step toward my metal folding chair, an incredibly tall, highly imposing figure suddenly smoothly appeared right in the open doorway of the grand foyer. It was a very tall, highly distinguished man wearing an incredibly sharp, perfectly tailored, expensive, dark gray business suit, holding a very thick, heavy black leather legal briefcase securely tightly in his right hand. It was Sterling, my incredibly highly paid, incredibly high-powered, ruthless corporate attorney. He walked completely calmly and incredibly confidently into the bright artificial light of the grand entryway, completely, totally ignoring the bright, flashing red and blue police lights shining outside the window. He looked completely calmly at the incredibly tense, dramatic, volatile scene actively unfolding directly in front of him and smoothly, casually adjusted his incredibly expensive dark silk tie. "Officers, I truly firmly believe you are currently speaking directly to the actual illegal trespasser," he announced, incredibly clearly, his incredibly smooth, highly powerful, confident voice echoing perfectly loudly and commanding absolute, immediate, complete attention in the completely, utterly empty dark house. The incredibly tall, imposing figure of Sterling, my high-powered corporate attorney, commanded absolute attention the second he stepped into the bright, artificial light of the grand foyer. He possessed a deeply intimidating aura of absolute professional certainty that instantly changed the entire volatile dynamic of the room. The two tense police officers immediately dropped their hands away from their heavy black service weapons, entirely unsure of how to properly process this sudden authoritative arrival. Chloe completely stopped her hysterical fake sobbing for a brief fraction of a second, her wide, tear-filled eyes darting wildly toward the open doorway. She had absolutely no idea who this sharp-suited man was, but she could instinctively feel the massive shift in power completely slipping away from her desperate grasp. Sterling calmly walked past the completely bewildered police officers, his expensive leather shoes making a slow, highly deliberate rhythmic sound against the bare hardwood floorboards. He stopped right beside my cheap gray metal folding table and gently placed his thick, heavy black leather legal briefcase directly onto the cold metal surface. He did not look at Chloe. He did not look at Jamal, who was still sitting completely defeated on the floor. He focused his sharp, intelligent gaze entirely on the two uniformed police officers. "Good evening, officers," Sterling said, his deep, smooth voice cutting cleanly through the thick, suffocating tension. "My name is Sterling Vance, and I am the Chief Legal Counsel for Nia Holdings Limited Liability Corporation. I deeply apologize that you were unnecessarily dragged out here on a cold Thanksgiving night based entirely on a completely fabricated malicious lie." The taller police officer frowned deeply, stepping slightly away from Chloe, who was still desperately clutching his dark blue uniform shirt. The officer looked back and forth between Sterling and my calm, seated figure. "Sir, we received a very frantic emergency call reporting a highly violent active hostage situation and a massive residential burglary," the officer stated firmly, his voice completely laced with heavy professional skepticism. "This woman claims she was violently cornered and aggressively threatened by the people sitting in this empty room." Sterling let out a very soft, entirely polite chuckle that completely dismissed her outrageous wild claims. He smoothly clicked open the shiny silver latches of his heavy leather briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, pristine stack of official legally binding documents printed on heavy, high-quality ivory paper. He turned and handed the top document directly to the suspicious police officer. "Officer, what you are currently holding is the official legally recorded county deed to this massive $2 million property," Sterling explained calmly, pointing a manicured finger at the bold black text. "As you can clearly see, this entire estate is fully legally owned by a corporate entity named Nia Holdings. My client, sitting perfectly calmly right here at this table, is the sole managing member and absolute legal owner of that specific corporate entity. She is the rightful legal property owner of this entire house. She cannot possibly illegally burglarize her very own property." The police officer carefully took the heavy paper and visually scanned the official county seals and the bold printed names. His facial expression rapidly shifted from highly tense suspicion to complete, total, utter confusion. He looked directly down at Chloe, who was rapidly losing her tight physical grip on his dark uniform shirt. "But she just explicitly told us this was her expensive house," the officer said slowly, his voice dropping to a very low, completely serious register. "She explicitly claimed these people violently broke in and aggressively stole all of her custom expensive furniture." Sterling reached right back into his open leather briefcase and smoothly pulled out a second thick stack of official corporate paperwork. He handed them directly to the second police officer standing nearby. "Those are the official commercial lease agreements for every single piece of luxury furniture and every single expensive decorative item that was previously located inside this house," Sterling continued, his voice echoing with devastating legal authority. "My client generously leased all of those expensive items through her corporate business account to help out her son. Tonight, she simply exercised her absolute legal right to quietly, completely remove her own corporate property from her own corporate building. There was absolutely no illegal robbery here tonight, officers. There is absolutely no violent hostage situation happening here tonight. There is only a deeply bitter, highly manipulative woman who is currently actively lying directly to sworn law enforcement officers." Chloe realized her entire fake victim narrative was violently collapsing right in front of her terrified eyes. She frantically tried to physically grab the officer's arm again, her voice rising into a highly desperate, shrill panic. "Do not listen to him!" she screamed wildly, fresh fake tears rapidly streaming down her pale cheeks. "He is completely lying to you. They made all of those fake documents up to completely steal my beautiful life. You have to arrest them right now." The taller officer violently, firmly pulled his arm completely away from her shaking hands, taking a very large physical step backward. His previously protective, gentle demeanor had completely entirely vanished, replaced by a very cold, highly annoyed professional law enforcement stance. He now fully realized he was being actively manipulated by a frantic, desperate liar. Sterling did not even pause to let her completely finish her hysterical screaming fit. He simply reached back into his heavy briefcase and pulled out another legally binding document. This one was encased inside a clear, heavy plastic protective sleeve. He handed it directly to the first police officer. Furthermore, Officer Sterling stated, his deep voice dropping to an incredibly serious, completely unforgiving tone. "This specific woman is currently legally trespassing on my client's private property. Exactly 3 weeks ago, my incredibly brilliant client began to deeply suspect severe financial anomalies actively occurring within her stepson's household. She legally hired my firm to quietly investigate. Once we fully discovered the massive, terrible truth, we immediately legally drafted a formal 30-day notice to quit the premises. Because she has absolutely no legal lease agreement and pays absolutely zero rent, she is legally classified as a simple guest." Sterling pointed his expensive pen directly at the clear plastic sleeve. That official legal eviction notice was formally served by a licensed process server directly to her permanent legal residence of record over 3 full weeks ago. The police officer looked up from the official legal document, his eyebrows raised in genuine, complete surprise. He looked directly at Chloe. Her permanent legal residence, the officer asked, seeking immediate verbal clarification. Sterling nodded his head slowly and turned his sharp, piercing gaze directly toward Brenda and Bradley, who were still standing completely frozen in the dark shadows near the grand foyer. "Yes," Officer Sterling replied smoothly. The official legal eviction notice was physically handed directly to her wealthy parents at their private residential estate. She has absolutely no legal right whatsoever to be standing inside this house tonight. She is currently illegally trespassing, and she fully knows it. Chloe let out a loud, horrific gasp of pure, absolute terror. She spun around wildly to look directly at her parents. Brenda physically shrank back against the bare painted drywall, completely unable to meet her daughter's panicked wide eyes. Bradley simply stared back at her with absolute cold, unfeeling, furious disgust. They had completely known about the formal legal eviction notice for weeks, but they had chosen to completely stay entirely silent because they were too incredibly embarrassed to publicly admit their daughter was a complete, total financial failure. They had silently, fully enabled her massive toxic delusions right up until the very bitter, devastating end. But Sterling was not quite finished completely dismantling her entire fake life. He reached directly down to my cheap gray metal table and picked up the thick, heavy manila folder I had been carefully guarding all night. He pulled out the original commercial loan application featuring the completely forged blue ink signature. He held it up so both tall police officers could clearly see the dense legal text. "Officers, my client did not simply evict this woman because of a simple minor family disagreement," Sterling said, his voice ringing out with absolute brutal legal finality. "She formally evicted her because this desperate woman is a highly dangerous con artist. This document right here is a highly fraudulent commercial loan application. This woman actively attempted to illegally secure a massive personal financial loan by fraudulently using my client's $2 million property as the primary legal collateral." The 2 police officers completely stiffened their hands, instinctively resting very close to their heavy utility belts once again, but this time they were looking entirely directly at Chloe. Sterling continued his devastating, relentless legal strike. And to fully complete this massive illegal financial crime, she completely forged her own husband's legal signature right there at the very bottom of the page. She called 911 tonight and actively manufactured a completely fake violent hostage situation because she fully desperately wanted you to illegally remove the actual rightful property owner from the premises. She is actively, violently attempting to use sworn local law enforcement officers to facilitate a massive federal bank fraud crime and completely cover her own terrible illegal tracks. The absolute, complete silence that followed Sterling's massive legal revelation was incredibly thick and completely, entirely suffocating. The reality of her massive, severe criminal actions had finally, completely, entirely caught up to her in the most incredibly devastating public way possible. The taller police officer let out a very long, heavy, annoyed sigh. He reached up and slowly wiped his tired face with his large hand. He looked directly at Chloe with a look of absolute, pure professional disgust. He now fully, completely understood exactly what was really happening in this dark, empty house tonight. "Ma'am," the tall officer said, his deep voice incredibly cold and completely, entirely devoid of any remaining human sympathy. "You have exactly 5 short minutes to physically walk upstairs, grab whatever small personal belongings you can easily carry in your own 2 hands, and immediately, peacefully exit this private property. If you are still standing anywhere inside this completely empty house when that 5 minutes is up, I am going to immediately legally place you under physical arrest for criminal trespassing and filing a completely false police report. And based entirely on those fraudulent financial documents that attorney is holding, I strongly suggest you immediately find yourself an incredibly good criminal defense lawyer by tomorrow morning." The devastating, brutal reality of the officer's final, absolute ultimatum struck Chloe like a massive, violent, physical blow to her chest. She physically stumbled backward, her expensive designer heels slipping slightly on the bare, smooth hardwood floorboards. She looked wildly, frantically around the completely massive, empty, echoing living room. She had absolutely no money left. She had absolutely no hidden secret credit cards left to use. She had absolutely no heavy luxury furniture to sell. She had absolutely no completely fake baby to use as a human shield. She had completely, entirely lost the massive, beautiful fake kingdom she had so viciously, desperately tried to steal from me tonight. In a final, pathetic act of absolute, pure, blind desperation, Chloe quickly turned her trembling body entirely toward the grand foyer. She aggressively ran directly toward her wealthy parents, her pale hands reaching out pleadingly in the dark shadows. "Mom! Dad!" she cried out incredibly loudly, her high-pitched voice cracking completely with absolute, genuine, pure terror this time. "You absolutely have to help me right now. You have to take me home with you tonight. I have absolutely nowhere else to go in the entire world. Please let me stay at your house tonight." She stopped just a few short feet away from them, waiting desperately for their warm, protective embrace. But Brenda did not reach out her arms to catch her crying daughter. The devastated, wealthy older woman slowly straightened her perfectly tailored, expensive coat, completely pulling her posture entirely upright. She looked directly straight into her lying daughter's panicked, wide blue eyes. The arrogant, wealthy woman who had openly mocked my successful life just a few short hours ago was completely, entirely gone. In her place stood a deeply broken, fiercely furious mother who had finally completely, entirely accepted the massive, ugly, terrible truth. Brenda took one slow, highly deliberate step backward, physically distancing herself from the incredibly toxic, dangerous criminal standing right in front of her. "You absolutely maliciously stole over $150,000 directly from our private secure retirement savings," Brenda said, her voice an incredibly quiet, completely deadly shaking whisper that echoed perfectly loudly in the entirely, completely empty, dark house. "You completely lied to us about absolutely every single thing in your entire fake life. You are a dangerous, vicious, completely manipulative thief." Brenda stared directly into Chloe's completely terrified, wide eyes, her face a cold, hard mask of absolute, pure, complete finality. "You completely destroyed our family tonight. You are absolutely not welcome in our home ever again. You need to gather your things and walk out that door because you are entirely, completely on your own now." The strict 5-minute countdown officially began. The taller police officer stood perfectly still near the entryway, his eyes watching Chloe's every frantic move. Sterling, my corporate attorney, snapped his black leather briefcase shut, the metallic sound echoing loudly in the empty living room. He stepped back into the dark shadows, allowing the brutal legal reality to crush the arrogant woman standing before us. Chloe looked wildly around the bare drywall, unable to process the absolute finality of her punishment. She had no luggage left in the house. My efficient moving crew had already packed all of her custom designer suitcases and luxury travel bags into the trucks outside. Marcus, my loyal logistics manager, quietly stepped through the open front door, holding a large roll of thick black, heavy-duty plastic garbage bags. He simply walked over to the bottom of the sweeping staircase and casually tossed the roll of cheap plastic bags directly onto the bare floorboards. The heavy roll landed with a dull, humiliating thud right at Chloe's designer feet. That was her only remaining luggage tonight. Cheap disposable trash bags meant for household waste. Chloe stared down at the plastic roll, her pale face twisting into a mask of pure horror and deep humiliation. She looked up at her wealthy parents, pleading silently with her wide, tear-filled eyes, but Brenda and Bradley had already turned their backs toward her. They were quietly speaking in hushed, angry whispers to the second police officer, separating their own respectable public reputation from their daughter's federal financial crimes. Chloe let out a pathetic, sobbing whimper. She slowly bent down her knees, trembling violently, and picked up the cheap roll of black plastic garbage bags. She turned her shaking body around and began the long, humiliating, slow climb up the bare wooden staircase. Every heavy step she took echoed loudly throughout the empty house, sounding exactly like the slow, steady ticking of a massive execution clock. I remained sitting calmly on my metal folding chair, listening intently to the chaotic noises echoing down from the second-floor master suite. We could clearly hear her frantically ripping the plastic garbage bags open, her heavy breathing echoing terribly in the quiet night air. We could hear her violently throwing her remaining clothes and personal toiletries directly into the cheap black plastic. She was desperately grabbing handfuls of silk dresses, designer cashmere sweaters, and custom-tailored blouses and aggressively shoving them haphazardly into the literal garbage bags. The satisfying irony of the entire situation was absolutely not lost on me tonight. Just a few short, painful hours ago, she had arrogantly texted me telling me that I was used to eating worthless scraps anyway. She had deliberately tried to make me feel incredibly small and entirely worthless in a luxury house that I had personally bought and paid for entirely with my own hard-earned money. And now she was frantically packing her entire fake, pathetic life into literal trash bags, while the actual rightful property owner sat perfectly calmly downstairs, surrounded by armed police officers and a brilliant corporate attorney. Jamal remained sitting on the cold, bare floorboards, completely paralyzed by the sheer devastating weight of his wife and her terrifying, unbelievable deception. He did not attempt to stand up to go upstairs and help her pack her things. He did not try to actively defend her honor or beg the stern police officers for any kind of special lenient mercy. He simply stared blankly at the bare drywall shattered by the horrific, ugly truth of the fake pregnancy medical documents and the massive stolen family retirement funds. His entire beautiful, comfortable, sheltered world had violently collapsed into fine dust right in front of his tired, devastated eyes. The 5 short minutes were rapidly expiring. The taller police officer looked directly down at his heavy dark wristwatch and cleared his throat loudly, signaling that the strict legal deadline had officially arrived tonight. Chloe finally slowly reappeared at the very top of the bare sweeping staircase. She looked absolutely unrecognizable from the haughty, confident, wealthy socialite who had walked through the heavy front door just a few short minutes ago. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was incredibly messy, hanging limply around her pale, tear-stained face. Her expensive silk dress was heavily wrinkled and covered in a fine layer of white drywall dust from frantic packing in the empty bedroom. She was heavily, awkwardly carrying 3 incredibly large, totally full, bulging black plastic garbage bags. The thin plastic stretched dangerously tightly over the sharp edges of her expensive designer shoes and hard perfume bottles. She looked exactly like a completely desperate, displaced person wandering aimlessly through an abandoned, empty warehouse. She began her completely humiliating final descent down the long, bare wooden staircase. The entire massive living room watched her complete, utter downfall in absolute, total silence. The 2 tall police officers watched her carefully, their hands resting entirely near their heavy, dark utility belts, fully making sure she did not try anything sudden or legally dangerous. Sterling. My corporate attorney watched her incredibly coldly, his sharp, intelligent eyes calculating the precise legal federal charges she was going to face tomorrow morning. Her wealthy, devastated parents, Brenda and Bradley, watched her silently, their older faces drained of any remaining emotional color or lingering parental sympathy. And I watched her entirely calmly, my posture perfectly straight and elegant, sitting right behind my cheap metal folding table. She heavily dragged the massive black plastic garbage bags down each bare wooden step, the loud scraping plastic sound completely filling the freezing cold night air. She finally reached the bare floorboards of the grand foyer, dropping the 3 large garbage bags directly onto the ground. She was breathing incredibly heavily, her thin chest rising and rapidly falling in exhausted, defeated movements. She could not bring herself to look directly into my calm eyes. She kept her completely humiliated gaze fixed squarely on the cold, bare wooden floor, entirely broken. She slowly reached down and picked up the thick, heavy plastic garbage bags, her pale hands violently shaking under the immense, awkward, terrible weight. She turned her incredibly defeated, broken body directly toward the large, open wooden front door, fully desperate to escape the massive, suffocating, heavy silence of the barren room. She just wanted to run away into the dark, freezing night and entirely hide from the massive, devastating consequences of her highly illegal criminal actions. But I was absolutely, entirely not quite finished with her tonight. I slowly, gracefully stood up from my cheap gray metal folding chair, my simple black dress flowing elegantly around my legs. I calmly reached down directly onto the bare metal table and picked up a single clear plastic storage container. I had deliberately saved this specific small clear plastic container from the massive, extensive moving packing process. I walked slowly, completely deliberately, incredibly calmly across the massive barren living room floor, entirely closing the physical distance between us. The sharp clicking sound of my own shoes echoed perfectly loudly, commanding absolute complete attention from every single person standing quietly inside the dark house. I stopped right directly, completely in front of her, physically blocking her absolute final path to the open front door. She finally slowly lifted her heavy, tear-stained face and looked directly straight into my entirely cold, unforgiving, calm eyes. She looked absolutely, completely terrified of me tonight. I slowly held out my right hand, offering her the small, clear plastic storage container. Inside the perfectly clear container was a small, perfectly neat portion of the roasted turkey truffle macaroni and cheese and sweet potato soufflé. "Do not forget to take your leftovers with you tonight, Chloe," I said, my voice entirely smooth and perfectly deadly cold in the quiet room. "You explicitly, confidently told me to eat all the leftovers tonight, but I decided to pack absolutely everything else up, so I would have plenty of room for them. It is going to be an incredibly long, cold walk for you tonight, so you might definitely need the extra energy." Chloe stared blindly down at the clear plastic container of perfectly cooked holiday food. A hot wave of ultimate humiliation violently washed over her pale, completely broken face. She realized fully that I had permanently won this terrible, bitter war tonight. She weakly reached out her shaking hand and snatched the food container aggressively from my calm, steady grip. She did not say a single word of apology or angry defiance. She simply threw the small container directly into the top of her thick black plastic garbage bags. She violently pushed forcefully past my standing figure, her heavy thick garbage bags loudly scraping against the doorframe. She practically ran out into the freezing cold dark November night, entirely disappearing into the deep dark shadows of the long winding driveway. The taller police officer let out a heavy, exhausted, completely tired sigh, shaking his shaved head in absolute, complete disbelief. "Have a safe, peaceful, completely quiet evening, ma'am," the serious officer said directly to me before silently turning around and walking completely out the heavy wooden front door, his partner closely following right behind him. Brenda and Bradley silently walked directly toward the completely open doorway without entirely looking back or saying a single tiny word of completely polite goodbye tonight. They simply walked out into the very cold, dark night, entirely leaving their horrible, toxic, lying daughter entirely behind to face her own massive federal criminal fate tomorrow morning. Sterling, my brilliant corporate attorney, gave me a small, professional, respectful, subtle nod before smoothly walking out directly behind the wealthy, devastated older parents, gently pulling the heavy wooden front door entirely shut right behind him. The loud, sharp, final clicking sound of the heavy brass deadbolt locking firmly, perfectly in place echoed terribly loudly throughout the massive, empty, echoing, barren, hollow house. Now it was just absolutely perfectly me and a completely shattered, entirely broken Jamal sitting perfectly alone in the complete, absolute, perfect silence. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked firmly into place. The loud metallic sound echoed violently through the massive, empty living room, signaling the final end of the chaotic night. The bright, flashing red and blue police lights outside the large bay windows finally faded away into the dark, freezing November distance. The wealthy, arrogant parents were gone. The aggressive law enforcement officers were gone. My brilliant corporate attorney was gone. And most importantly, the vicious, manipulative sociopath who had desperately tried to steal absolutely everything I owned was gone forever. The grand $2 million luxury house was now entirely silent. It was a deeply heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed intensely against the bare, painted drywall. The massive, cavernous space felt incredibly cold and entirely hollow, without the expensive custom velvet sectionals and the large hand-woven silk rugs. It was just me and Jamal, entirely alone in the dark shadows. Jamal was still sitting awkwardly on the cold, bare hardwood floorboards, right where he had completely collapsed earlier tonight. His long legs were pulled up tightly against his chest, and his face was buried deeply in his shaking hands. The tall, strong, confident young man who had angrily screamed. He commanded me to get out of his house just a few short minutes ago, but that man had completely vanished. In his place sat an entirely broken, devastated, completely lost little boy. He was violently crying, his broad shoulders heaving heavily, with deep, agonizing, racking sobs that tore through the quiet, empty room. He was finally mourning the devastating, brutal death of his beautiful fake life. He was mourning the fake, loving wife, the fake, innocent, unborn baby, the fake, massive financial wealth, and the fake, elite social status he thought he had permanently secured. He had surrendered. He surrendered his own loyal family for a beautiful, toxic illusion, and now he was sitting alone in the absolute empty rubble of his own terrible choices. I did not immediately rush over to comfort him. I did not kneel down on the cold floorboards and wrap my arms tightly around his shaking shoulders to quietly tell him that absolutely everything was going to be perfectly fine. He deeply needed to feel the massive, agonizing, painful weight of his own massive betrayal tonight. He needed to fully understand the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what he had almost entirely lost forever. He lost everything because of his own crippling, blind insecurities. I remained sitting perfectly calmly on my cheap gray metal folding chair, keeping my posture completely straight and my hands resting quietly on the bare metal table. I watched him cry for a very long time, simply allowing the heavy, thick silence to force him to deeply reflect on his terrible actions. Finally, Jamal slowly lifted his heavy, tear-stained face from his shaking hands. His dark eyes were incredibly red and completely swollen from the violent crying. He looked around the barren, empty living room as if he were seeing the absolute stark reality of his situation for the very first time tonight. He looked at the bare drywall where the expensive modern art used to hang. He looked at the empty corners where the custom designer lamps used to stand, and then he slowly, painfully turned his devastated gaze directly toward me. "Mom," he whispered, his deep voice cracking heavily with immense, raw emotional pain and absolute, profound, total shame. "I am so incredibly sorry. I am so deeply sorry for absolutely everything I said to you tonight. I am so sorry I let her completely disrespect you in your own house." He took a very deep, shaky breath, rapidly wiping the hot, salty tears from his pale cheeks with the back of his trembling hand. "I was completely, utterly blind," he continued, his voice echoing softly in the vast, empty space. I wanted to completely believe her beautiful lies so incredibly badly because she made me feel like I was finally completely part of the elite wealthy upper class. When my tech startup business completely failed 8 months ago, I felt like an absolute total massive failure. I felt like I was completely letting you down and entirely destroying the massive legacy you and my dad built for me. I felt incredibly worthless and entirely inadequate. But Chloe looked at me and she made me feel completely successful. Her wealthy, arrogant parents accepted me into their highly exclusive country club world, and I finally felt like I truly belonged somewhere important. I was entirely terrified that if I ever corrected her false assumptions about the house or the money, she would immediately realize I was a complete fake and completely leave me alone. He lowered his heavy head, entirely unable to maintain eye contact with my calm, steady gaze. I was so incredibly, deeply insecure that I actively, willingly let her treat the amazing woman who literally built my entire life like a completely worthless servant. He confessed, his voice breaking into a fresh wave of heavy, agonizing sobs. I actively let her cruelly insult your beautiful natural hair and completely mock your highly successful business because I was too incredibly cowardly to stand up and completely defend you. I completely chose a vicious, lying sociopath over my own loving mother tonight. I chose her because I desperately wanted to keep living inside a beautiful, comfortable, totally fake dream. I am a complete, total, massive disappointment to you and to my dad. I listened entirely completely to his agonizing, deeply painful confession. I heard the genuine, raw, absolute regret in his shaking voice, but I absolutely refused to immediately completely coddle his heavily bruised, fragile ego tonight. I slowly, gracefully stood up from the cheap gray metal folding chair, my simple, elegant black dress completely smooth and perfectly unwrinkled. I walked slowly, completely deliberately across the bare, cold, hardwood floorboards entirely. I walked, closing the physical distance between us. I stood directly, completely over him, looking down at his broken, entirely defeated physical posture. You truly, deeply, fundamentally misunderstand exactly what a real legacy actually is. Jamal, I said, my voice incredibly firm, completely steady and echoing loudly in the completely barren house. You genuinely, completely thought a legacy was a massive $2 million luxury house filled entirely with expensive custom-leased furniture. You thought a legacy was an exclusive country club membership and a beautiful blonde wife who only completely loved you because she falsely thought you had money. She thought you had a massive, overflowing bank account. I took a deep breath, letting the cold night air fill my lungs. Your amazing father and I did not build our incredibly successful, massive restaurant empire by pretending to be wealthy elite socialites. I continued, my voice dropping to a deeply passionate, entirely intense register. We built our actual real legacy by waking up every single morning at exactly 4 o'clock in the dark, freezing morning. We completely built it by working grueling 18-hour shifts inside an incredibly hot, greasy, suffocating kitchen. We built it by personally scrubbing the dirty, greasy floorboards on our actual hands and knees until our fingers completely bled and our muscles totally physically ached. Your incredible father smelled exactly like cheap industrial bleach and heavy frying oil for the first 10 entire years of our difficult marriage. He did not care absolutely anything about impressing wealthy, arrogant, judgmental people like Brenda and Bradley. He only completely cared about providing a safe, highly secure, deeply loving, solid foundation for you to grow up on. I knelt down very slowly on the cold, bare wood, placing myself entirely. I placed myself completely at his eye level. I looked directly straight into his bloodshot, completely devastated, dark eyes. You let a highly toxic, manipulative, dangerous woman completely poison your entire mind. Because you were desperately, entirely seeking conditional love, I told him, my voice absolutely, completely unwavering and incredibly sharp. Conditional love is an incredibly, highly dangerous, absolute poison, Jamal. Chloe only completely loved the massive fake wealth she falsely believed you actually possessed. The very exact second she totally realized the massive money was entirely an illusion, she aggressively, viciously, completely turned into a terrifying racist. She turned into a monster right before your eyes. She manufactured a fake pregnancy and dialed 911. That is what conditional love buys you. It buys massive federal financial fraud and devastating ruin. Jamal sobbed quietly, nodding his head. He finally understood the terrible gravity of his foolish mistakes. I slowly reached into my simple black dress and pulled out the heavy metal ring holding the master keys. I tossed them to him. "I am not kicking you out, Jamal," I said, "but you are not living here for free anymore. You are going to earn your legacy." 3 exact months had passed since that freezing cold Thanksgiving night when I completely dismantled the fake luxury life my stepson and his vicious wife had been living. The harsh, bitter winter had slowly given way to a brisk early spring, but the intense heat inside my flagship downtown restaurant was absolutely sweltering. It was a completely packed Friday night service, and the massive industrial kitchen was a loud, chaotic symphony of shouting line cooks, clanging metal pans, and fiercely sizzling hot oil. Right in the incredibly chaotic center of the busy hot line, standing directly over a massive blazing grill, was Jamal. He was wearing a plain white, slightly stained chef coat and a tight black apron. His previously perfectly manicured hands were now covered in small, fresh burns and rough, thick calluses. Thick beads of heavy sweat rapidly dripped down his dark forehead, stinging his tired eyes as he aggressively flipped a row of thick, expensive steaks. He was no longer the arrogant, entitled young man who wore custom-tailored, expensive suits and casually drank fine imported wine while proudly taking credit for my grueling hard work. He was now just a junior line cook earning minimum wage and working exactly the way his late father and I had worked over a decade ago. He was finally learning the true heavy value of a single hard-earned dollar from the absolute grueling bottom up. I stood quietly near the heavy swinging metal kitchen doors, holding a clean white clipboard, watching him intensely. He had shown up at my corporate office the very morning after the massive eviction, looking completely shattered and begging for absolutely any job I could give him. He had completely filed for a legal divorce from Chloe the very next week, severing all remaining ties to her massive, terrifying web of financial fraud. I did not give him a cushy corporate management job sitting inside a nice, comfortable, air-conditioned office. I handed him a cheap white apron and placed him on the absolute lowest rung of my entire restaurant empire. I told him he had to scrub the greasy floors, prep the raw vegetables, and stand over the hot, blazing fires until his legs physically shook from total exhaustion. And to my genuine absolute surprise, he actually listened without a single word of complaint. He worked massive, grueling 14-hour shifts entirely without a single break. He politely answered to the senior chefs, and he respectfully learned the incredibly difficult, intricate rhythms of a high-end professional kitchen. He was slowly, painfully, physically sweating out the highly toxic, arrogant poison Chloe had maliciously fed him for the past 6 months. He quickly plated a perfectly cooked steak, wiping the edge of the expensive white ceramic plate with a clean towel, just like I had strictly taught him. He shouted the order number loudly over the intense kitchen noise, handing the hot plate directly to a rushing server. He briefly looked up and caught my calm, watchful eye across the crowded hot room. He gave me a very small, tired, but completely genuine nod before quickly turning right back to his hot, blazing grill. He was finally slowly becoming a man his father would be incredibly proud of. The rebuilding phase of our completely shattered family relationship was going to be a very long, incredibly difficult journey, but for the very first time in almost an entire year, I actually felt a tiny spark of genuine, real hope. I smiled softly to myself and turned around to walk back into the main, elegant dining room. But my quiet feeling of peaceful victory was completely short-lived. As I walked into the crowded, loud dining room, my loyal logistics manager, Marcus, rapidly approached me. His normally calm face was completely tense, and he was holding his glowing smartphone tightly in his hand. He quickly pulled me aside into a quiet, dark corner near the expensive wine cellar, completely away from the happy dining guests. "You absolutely need to look at this right now, Nia," he whispered, his deep voice laced with genuine, serious concern. He handed me his glowing phone screen. I looked down and my heart immediately sank heavily in my chest. It was a viral video posted directly on a highly popular social media platform. The video featured Chloe. She was sitting in a dimly lit, cheap-looking bedroom wearing a completely plain, oversized sweater with no makeup on her pale face. She had carefully crafted her physical appearance to look incredibly frail, totally exhausted, and completely victimized. She was crying those exact same fake salty tears she had used to desperately manipulate Jamal and the police officers 3 months ago. The caption below the highly edited video read the ugly, toxic truth behind Nia's luxury restaurant empire. I tapped the small screen and her high-pitched whining voice began to play softly. I need to bravely speak out today about a highly toxic, deeply hostile company that is completely ruining lives, she lied, looking directly into the small camera lens with perfect fake sincerity. The owner of Nia Holdings is an incredibly abusive, cruel woman who systematically completely destroys her own employees and family members. I was completely thrown out onto the winter streets while I was heavily pregnant just because I bravely tried to report her terrible illegal business practices. She runs a deeply abusive, hostile work environment where people are constantly verbally attacked and financially exploited. Please absolutely refuse to support her terrible restaurants. Do not give your hard-earned money to such a vicious, completely evil woman. The highly manipulative lying video already had hundreds of thousands of views and thousands of angry comments from completely strangers who blindly believed her completely fabricated emotional story. Chloe had absolutely no legal leg to stand on and absolutely no real money left, so she had completely resorted to the only cheap weapon she still had available. She had weaponized the entire internet against my hard-earned business reputation. Because I had successfully legally evicted her and forced Jamal to quickly divorce her, she was now seeking completely blind, unadulterated public revenge. She was actively, deliberately attempting to violently burn down the massive culinary empire I had spent over a decade building just to satisfy her own sick, twisted, petty, vindictive rage. I quickly handed the glowing phone back to Marcus. My jaw clenched completely tight with rising, furious anger. "How bad is the actual damage right now?" I asked him, keeping my voice completely low and entirely steady despite the sudden terrifying threat. Marcus let out a very heavy, deeply frustrated sigh. "It is getting incredibly bad very fast, boss," he replied, running a stressed hand over his short hair. "The angry online mob is rapidly review bombing absolutely all 4 of our restaurant locations online. They are leaving thousands of fake 1-star reviews claiming they got terrible food poisoning or that our staff was incredibly racist and rude to them." He pulled up another screen on his phone showing our main corporate booking system. "We have already had over 50 high-end reservations completely cancel in just the last 2 short hours alone." Marcus continued, his voice incredibly grim. "Several large corporate event planners who usually book our massive private dining rooms for their expensive holiday parties have just called to nervously pause their expensive contracts. They explicitly cited the viral social media video and said they do not want to be publicly associated with a supposedly toxic, hostile company. If this highly coordinated fake smear campaign continues to gain massive traction, we are going to lose millions of dollars in highly projected revenue by the end of this month." The devastating reality of his dire financial report hit me like a massive, heavy physical blow. Chloe was not just a pathetic, annoying nuisance anymore. She was an active, incredibly dangerous financial threat to the livelihood of every single loyal employee who worked incredibly hard for my restaurant group. She was actively trying to completely destroy the massive family legacy I was currently trying to teach Jamal how to properly respect and eventually inherit. My strict initial punishment of simply stripping away her fake luxury life and leaving her with nothing but cheap plastic garbage bags was completely insufficient. I had falsely believed that completely cutting her off financially and kicking her entirely out of our private lives would be enough to make her disappear forever. But toxic, manipulative sociopaths like Chloe do not just quietly disappear into the dark night. When you take away their stolen power, they completely mutate and desperately find entirely new, highly destructive ways to violently attack you from the shadows. I looked directly across the packed dining room, watching my hardworking servers carrying expensive food and my happy, loyal guests enjoying their peaceful evening. I was absolutely not going to sit back and actively let a desperate, lying, criminal con artist destroy the incredibly beautiful empire I had built with my own literal blood sweat and bitter tears. I turned my intense, sharp gaze back to Marcus, my mind already rapidly calculating my next massive, highly aggressive move. "Get Sterling on the phone right now." I commanded, my voice entirely cold, completely deadly, and absolutely devoid of any remaining mercy. "Tell our attorney to completely drop whatever else he is currently working on tonight. Tell him to meet me in my private corporate office in exactly 20 short minutes." I looked directly back at the hot, busy kitchen doors, where Jamal was still sweating heavily over the blazing hot grill, completely entirely unaware of the massive new digital war his vicious ex-wife had just violently started. I had let her completely walk away from the massive $2 million house 3 months ago with a strict, firm warning, but she had foolishly, completely ignored it. She wanted to play highly dangerous public games with my massive corporate business and my family name. She desperately wanted to pretend to be a completely helpless, innocent victim for the entire gullible internet to see. I was going to deeply regret giving her that small plastic container of leftover food because now she was going to completely starve. Cutting her off was absolutely not enough anymore. I fully realized I had to legally completely silence her forever. I had to completely crush her entirely into the ground until she could never speak my name ever again. She chose to wage a completely fabricated digital war against a woman who possessed unlimited legal resources and absolutely zero patience for ignorant thieves. I was going to systematically dismantle her entirely false online persona piece by piece until absolutely nobody believed a single solitary word she ever said. I calmly walked toward my office, ready to completely finish this forever. Exactly 48 hours after the malicious viral video first appeared online, I sat completely, perfectly still inside the highly intimidating glass-walled executive boardroom of Sterling's massive downtown corporate law firm. The heavy mahogany conference table was incredibly long and polished to an absolute mirror finish, reflecting the gloomy gray sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sterling sat quietly right next to me, arranging a series of incredibly thick black legal binders with absolute meticulous precision. We had officially invited Chloe to a formal legal mediation meeting under the complete false pretense of negotiating a quiet financial settlement to quickly end her incredibly destructive digital smear campaign. She genuinely falsely believed she had finally successfully backed a highly powerful, wealthy woman completely into a desperate corner. She thought I was bleeding massive amounts of money and begging for sudden mercy. The heavy glass boardroom door finally swung open exactly 20 minutes past the scheduled meeting time. Chloe strutted incredibly aggressively into the quiet room, completely radiating a highly toxic, deeply unearned arrogance. She was wearing a very bright, highly inappropriate red designer dress that she had likely purchased using yet another secret, fraudulent credit card. She carried a cheap-looking imitation designer handbag, completely dropping the entirely fake, helpless victim persona she had so tearfully performed for the internet just 2 days ago. She did not bring a single defense attorney with her because she arrogantly fully believed she was completely the smartest person in any room she ever entered. She pulled out a heavy leather chair directly across from us, dragging it loudly aggressively against the polished, expensive floorboards, and threw her cheap bag directly onto the pristine mahogany table. She leaned back, crossing her arms and offering me a deeply vicious, highly victorious smirk. "Well, Nia," she began, her high-pitched voice echoing loudly with absolute pure venomous delight. "It looks like your little restaurant empire is not quite as completely invincible as you originally falsely thought it was. It is incredibly, truly amazing what one single honest video can do to completely ruin a supposedly spotless public reputation." I did not say a single word in response to her arrogant taunts. I simply stared directly, completely into her cold blue eyes, keeping my face an absolute unreadable mask of cold stone. Chloe falsely took my total silence as a massive sign of absolute weakness and quickly leaned forward, placing her elbows aggressively onto the table. "Let us completely skip all the boring legal pleasantries today," she demanded, her eyes gleaming with dark, greedy anticipation. "I know exactly why you called me here to this fancy, expensive office. You are losing massive amounts of money every single day, and you desperately want me to completely delete my viral video before your entire fake business completely, entirely, permanently collapses. So here are my absolute final non-negotiable terms." She continued, her voice dripping with extreme, unearned confidence. "I want a complete, guaranteed, clean legal divorce from your pathetic stepson Jamal, but I want a massive, permanent monthly alimony payment securely locked in for the next 10 years to perfectly maintain the luxury lifestyle I entirely deserve. And additionally, for you specifically, Nia, I want a one-time tax-free lump sum cash payout of exactly $500,000. If you wire that exact massive amount of money directly into my personal checking account by tomorrow morning, I will gracefully delete the viral video and completely stop actively destroying your precious family legacy. If you completely refuse to pay me, I will gladly, enthusiastically go on every single daytime television talk show in this country and cry about how you violently, completely abused me." The heavy, suffocating silence returned to the massive corporate boardroom. Chloe sat there incredibly smugly, entirely fully believing she had just executed the absolute perfect, flawless financial checkmate against me. She completely, genuinely thought she was entirely walking out of this building $500,000 richer. Sterling let out a very slow, incredibly deep sigh, completely shaking his perfectly groomed head in absolute, pure, professional disbelief. He slowly, gracefully stood up from his expensive leather chair, picking up the thickest, heaviest black binder resting on the table. He did not gently slide it across the smooth wood. He lifted it high and forcefully dropped it directly, completely flat onto the table right in front of Chloe. The massive, booming, heavy thud physically made her jump violently back in her seat, her arrogant, victorious smirk slightly, entirely faltering for the very first time. "Ms. Chloe Sterling," began his deep, powerful, highly authoritative voice, completely filling every single inch of the large glass room. "You completely, fundamentally, deeply misunderstand exactly why we legally invited you here today. We absolutely did not invite you here to negotiate a financial surrender. We legally invited you here today to offer you exactly one single, final, fleeting chance to save your own life before we completely, permanently, completely destroy it." He opened the heavy black binder, revealing hundreds of incredibly dense legal pages. "What you are currently looking at is a massive, highly detailed civil defamation and tortious interference lawsuit prepared directly against you," Sterling explained, completely, coldly, entirely devoid of any human mercy. "Over the past 48 short hours, my elite team of corporate investigators has successfully, completely, entirely subpoenaed all of the digital metadata behind your highly malicious smear campaign," Sterling continued sharply. "We have completely successfully proven, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that your viral video is a massive, intentional, fabricated lie, deliberately, specifically designed to cause massive, severe financial harm to my clients, highly successful corporate entity. My incredibly brilliant client has absolutely already lost exactly $412,000 in immediately canceled private corporate catering contracts directly solely because of your completely false, malicious public statements. We are formally suing you in civil court for exactly $2 million in complete comprehensive corporate damages." Chloe completely scoffed, waving her pale hand aggressively in the air, pretending to be entirely unbothered by his massive legal threat. "You cannot successfully sue someone who currently has absolutely no money." She laughed highly, bitterly, completely exposing her own total financial ruin. "I am already completely, entirely, heavily, deeply in debt. You cannot possibly completely squeeze any fresh blood from a totally dry stone. Go ahead and sue me all you want. I literally, legally have absolutely nothing left for you to take from me." Sterling did not smile, but his incredibly sharp, dark eyes absolutely, completely gleamed with a highly dangerous, lethal intensity. "That is exactly precisely where you are incredibly, completely wrong, Miss Chloe," he smoothly countered, reaching directly into his perfectly tailored suit jacket pocket. "We completely entirely know you have absolutely no money left to pay a massive civil judgment. That is exactly specifically why the massive civil lawsuit is only the absolute very beginning of your massive, terrifying legal nightmare." He pulled out a single crisp, folded piece of paper and slowly unfolded it. He placed it incredibly deliberately right on top of the massive, heavy black binder. It was a formal legal copy of the highly fraudulent commercial loan application containing Jamal's completely forged blue ink signature. Because you completely intentionally used a federally insured banking institution to actively attempt to illegally secure a massive fraudulent financial loan using my client's private property as totally fake collateral, you have actively successfully committed federal wire fraud and massive federal bank fraud, Sterling stated, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying, deadly register. "Early yesterday morning, I personally hand-delivered the completely undeniable original hard copies of this massively fraudulent document directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They have officially actively opened a massive, serious criminal probe into your highly illegal financial activities. The massive civil lawsuit will completely, entirely bankrupt you for the rest of your natural adult life. But the massive federal criminal charges will absolutely guarantee that you spend the next 10 to 15 years living completely inside a tiny concrete federal prison cell. The incredibly arrogant, highly toxic, confident mask completely, violently, entirely shattered. The bright fake color completely, totally drained directly out of Chloe's pale, terrified face, leaving her looking incredibly sickly and totally, completely defeated. Her blue eyes grew incredibly, massively wide with absolute, pure, unadulterated cold terror. Her shaking hands slowly crept up to completely cover her trembling mouth. She realized with absolute, total, horrifying crystal clarity that she had completely miscalculated exactly who she was violently dealing with. She had completely foolishly brought a tiny, cheap plastic water gun to a massive, highly explosive thermonuclear war. She was not walking away with $500,000 today. She was literally staring directly down the dark, terrifying, massive barrel of a long, brutal federal prison sentence. I slowly, completely calmly pushed my heavy leather chair completely back and entirely stood up. I walked slowly, completely, deliberately around the massive, long, polished table until I was standing directly, completely over her terrified, trembling, shaking, broken figure. I looked completely, entirely down at her, offering absolutely zero mercy and absolutely zero pity. "You wanted to completely play dangerous digital games with my hard-earned family legacy, Chloe," I said, my voice entirely smooth, perfectly cold, and completely deadly. "You wanted to actively, intentionally, completely try to financially ruin the exact same incredibly hardworking, innocent people who actually physically feed my loving community. So here is the absolute only final deal you are ever going to get from me in this lifetime." I pointed my finger directly at an incredibly thin secondary file folder resting quietly next to Sterling's briefcase. Inside that small folder is an ironclad, comprehensive, completely unbreakable non-disclosure agreement and a completely, totally clean legal divorce settlement from my stepson Jamal. I told her, keeping my steady, intense gaze locked completely securely onto her terrified, crying, wide eyes. "You are going to sign absolutely, completely every single page of that legal divorce right now today. You are going to formally, entirely legally ask for absolutely zero financial alimony and absolutely zero division of non-existent marital assets. You're also going to immediately sign the massive ironclad non-disclosure agreement legally permanently, barring you from ever publicly speaking about me, my family, my incredibly successful restaurant business, or my stepson ever again for the complete, entire rest of your pathetic natural life." But that is absolutely not all. I continued, my voice rising slightly, demanding complete, total submission. Before you legally sign absolutely any of those binding papers, you are going to take out your expensive glowing smartphone right here, right now, in this incredibly quiet room. You are going to actively record a completely new, entirely truthful video. You are going to publicly, explicitly, completely admit to your entire internet audience that you completely, intentionally, entirely lied about me and my successful business because you were incredibly highly bitter and deeply angry about your totally failed marriage. You are going to completely, publicly retract absolutely every single false negative statement you ever made. You are going to completely delete the original highly malicious video. You are going to completely post the honest public retraction immediately. If you successfully, perfectly, completely do all of those specific exact things right now, my brilliant attorney will officially successfully withdraw the massive federal criminal complaint, and we will entirely legally drop the massive $2 million civil lawsuit today. I leaned down incredibly close, completely invading her personal physical space, making entirely absolutely sure she fully felt the massive, terrifying, suffocating weight of my massive, absolute total power. If you refuse to perfectly complete absolutely even one single tiny condition of this deal today, I will actively legally press the button on the massive federal criminal charges before you can even physically walk out of this glass room, I whispered, entirely coldly, entirely deadly. And I promise you, Chloe, I will completely, actively, happily use my massive, endless financial wealth to absolutely ensure that the federal prosecutors completely, entirely bury you, completely, entirely under the actual prison. Chloe was completely physically, violently shaking, sobbing, completely hysterically, entirely out of pure, absolute freezing cold terror. She did not attempt to loudly argue or fiercely, completely negotiate. She completely, instantly grabbed her expensive glowing smartphone with incredibly, wildly trembling, pale hands. She frantically, rapidly hit the record button and practically screamed out her incredibly tearful, desperate, complete, absolute, highly public digital retraction, immediately, completely begging for absolute internet forgiveness. She rapidly, aggressively deleted the fake viral video. When she completely, entirely finished her incredibly humiliating, highly public digital surrender, she violently, quickly snatched the heavy, expensive metal pen completely right out of Sterling's waiting, calm hand. She frantically, aggressively signed her highly cursive, entirely shaking name on absolutely every single legal line we entirely demanded. She signed the massive divorce. She signed the massive NDA, and she completely, entirely surrendered absolutely everything, completely, perfectly saving her own entirely pathetic, terrible, completely ruined life. Exactly 6 months had passed since that freezing cold night when I dismantled the fake luxury world my stepson and his vicious ex-wife had built. The harsh winter had finally melted away, bringing a warm, bright summer to the bustling city. Tonight, the elegant dining room of my flagship downtown restaurant was closed to the general public. Instead, the beautiful space was filled with my loyal, hardworking staff, my closest trusted friends, and the most supportive members of my local community. We were throwing a joyous private party to celebrate a monumental professional milestone. Just 3 days ago, the highly prestigious Culinary Committee had officially awarded our beloved restaurant its incredibly rare second Michelin star. The heavy crystal chandelier above the main dining floor cast a warm golden glow over the crowded room, highlighting the joyful, smiling faces of everyone who had helped me build this successful empire from the ground up. The air was thick with the delicious smells of slow roasted meats, rich, decadent desserts, and expensive, bubbly champagne. It was a beautiful, loud celebration of pure, authentic Black excellence and undeniable, relentless hard work. I stood quietly near the polished mahogany bar, absorbing the beautiful, chaotic, joyful scene actively unfolding right in front of my grateful eyes. I was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that perfectly complemented my natural hair and my glowing skin. I was absolutely no longer the exhausted, stressed-out woman furiously scrubbing dirty antique plates alone in a dark, quiet kitchen on Thanksgiving night. I was a victorious, highly respected, successful culinary titan standing proudly at the very top of my professional industry. I watched my dedicated kitchen staff dancing happily to the loud, upbeat music, letting go of all their heavy daily stress. They were my chosen family, and I was deeply proud of every single one of them tonight. But the greatest source of my immense pure joy tonight was not the prestigious shiny new culinary award or the overflowing corporate bank accounts. The absolute greatest total victory was standing right next to me holding a tall, elegant crystal glass of sparkling apple cider. Jamal looked fundamentally different than he did 6 short months ago. He was completely transformed from the inside out. He was no longer the insecure, arrogant, entitled young man who desperately craved the conditional fake validation of wealthy, ignorant, racist people. He was absolutely no longer hiding cowardly behind a manipulative, lying con artist. He was standing incredibly tall, his broad shoulders relaxed, and his dark eyes shining brightly with genuine, pure, unadulterated pride. He was wearing a perfectly crisp, clean white chef coat with his own name proudly, permanently embroidered right over his heart. Over the past 6 grueling months, he had dedicated every single waking hour of his young life to completely mastering the incredibly difficult, intense culinary arts. He had humbly started at the very absolute bottom, entirely scrubbing greasy floors and prepping massive piles of raw vegetables. But through his own relentless, undeniable hard work and pure, deep dedication, he had successfully earned his rightful place on the hotline. He was now officially my talented, highly respected junior sous chef. He finally understood the incredibly heavy true value of a hard-earned dollar, and he completely understood the profound weight of our true family legacy. Jamal turned his handsome face toward me and offered me a warm, absolutely genuine wide smile. "We did it, Mom," he said, his deep voice filled with pure, deep, authentic love and profound, immense respect. "We absolutely built something incredibly amazing together." I smiled back at him, feeling a massive hot wave of pure maternal pride completely wash over my entire soul. "We certainly did, Jamal," I replied softly, gently tapping my expensive crystal champagne flute directly against his tall glass. Just as we shared that beautiful, quiet, intimate moment, my expensive, glowing smartphone suddenly vibrated softly inside my elegant designer clutch purse. I slowly, calmly reached inside and smoothly pulled the slim device out fully, expecting to see a simple, congratulatory text message from a busy, absent friend. Instead, I completely saw a highly unexpected picture message entirely sent by a random former wealthy socialite acquaintance who used to heavily run in the exact same highly exclusive snobby circles as Chloe's arrogant parents. I slowly, smoothly tapped the bright, glowing screen to fully open the digital image. The incredibly clear digital photograph showed a very tired-looking young woman actively working behind a cheap plastic register at a massive discount retail clothing store. She was wearing a highly unflattering, stiff, cheap uniform polo shirt and a mandatory plastic name tag. Her previously perfectly styled, expensive bright blonde hair was messy flat and heavily tied back in a careless ponytail. Her pale face was devoid of any expensive custom makeup, entirely revealing the dark, heavy, exhausted circles permanently resting right under her sad blue eyes. It was Chloe. She looked absolutely miserable. The completely massive, devastating federal wire fraud investigation had permanently destroyed absolutely any tiny, lingering chance she ever possessed of securing another wealthy, successful, gullible husband. The highly, incredibly heavy, deep civil defamation lawsuit had successfully permanently drained every single tiny, hidden remaining penny to her completely ruined name. Her highly arrogant, wealthy parents had permanently, completely disowned her, utterly refusing to ever publicly associate with a legally documented federal criminal. She was now completely, permanently trapped in the exact same incredibly harsh, completely unforgiving minimum wage reality she used to completely, publicly, loudly mock. I stared quietly down at the highly revealing digital photograph for a very long, totally silent moment. I did not feel any sudden massive wave of dark, malicious, vindictive joy. I did not feel the sudden, deep, profound, heavy need to loudly publicly gloat or aggressively brag about her massive total public downfall. I completely, simply felt absolutely nothing at all for her. She was completely, permanently an absolute irrelevant ghost, entirely permanently haunting the distant past. The absolute greatest, massive, true revenge was simply living an absolutely perfectly spectacular, massive, joyous, beautiful, successful life, entirely fully without her toxic, highly negative, dark presence. I entirely calmly, slowly pressed the small side button on my expensive phone, completely instantly making the glowing bright screen completely permanently go dark. I completely, slowly, gracefully slipped the small quiet device permanently deeply back into my beautiful, expensive, elegant designer bag. I took an incredibly deep, calming breath, completely filling my healthy, strong lungs with the incredibly delicious, sweet-smelling, joyful, happy, warm evening air. I entirely, completely turned my total, complete, physical, full attention entirely back to the massive, highly successful, beautiful, joyous, loud, incredible party entirely actively happening right all around me. I slowly, gracefully raised my expensive crystal glass of highly expensive, bubbly champagne incredibly high into the warm, bright, glowing, golden air. I entirely, completely, gently clinked it softly directly against Jamal's tall glass of sparkling, clear apple cider. To our incredibly beautiful, bright, highly successful, amazing, long-lasting, beautiful, strong, true, authentic, deeply powerful legacy, I said, my voice completely echoing warmly in the bright, happy room. If you completely, absolutely, entirely enjoyed hearing this incredibly beautiful, satisfying, true story of pure, total revenge and massive, total, beautiful, deep family healing, today, please make sure to entirely drop a beautiful, happy comment completely below right now. Please definitely completely hit that massive like button, completely and entirely strongly. Please subscribe to the beautiful, amazing channel for incredibly amazing, absolutely true, dramatic stories. Thank you incredibly, completely, deeply for entirely, completely, absolutely listening tonight.